Hey there and welcome back. Tonight, if the day has worn you thin, you are allowed to set the whole of it down, not to solve anything, not to plan tomorrow, only to let your shoulders come away from your ears and your breath go loose. This is one of those evenings made for drifting somewhere far from your own life, and tonight we are traveling a long way west, to the raw edge of the American frontier, to lamplit mining camps and rutted wagon roads, and a woman whose name outran her the way a rumor outruns the truth. Her name was Martha Jane, though almost nobody remembers her by it. The world called her Calamity Jane, and the world thought it knew exactly who she was. It did not. Because far above a rough town in the Black Hills, on a hill among the pines there is a grave, and the woman buried in it spent her last breath asking to be laid down beside a man who, as far as anyone can honestly tell, never once loved her back. We are going to find out how she came to lie there. Before we set out on that road together, let me say the gentle, familiar thing. If these long evening journeys give you somewhere soft to land at the end of a hard day, you are welcome to follow along, so that whenever the noise of the world gets to be too much, there is always another quiet night like this one waiting for you. I always like to know who is out there in the dark with me, so if you feel like it, you can leave a note telling me where you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you are, whether it is late and still, or grey and raining, or somewhere warm with the window open. I look through those notes more than you would think, little signals from bedrooms and kitchens and long night shifts scattered halfway round the earth, all of us awake and quiet together while a story unspools. And that is exactly the company Martha Jane spent her life chasing and rarely keeping. Picture this. A small town in northern Missouri, in the last spring before the country tore itself in two over the question of slavery. The year is 1852. The streets are mud where they are anything at all, and the houses lean into the wind coming off the prairie, and the whole settlement smells of wood smoke and horses, and the green of new grass pushing up along the creek. This is Princeton, in Mercer County, close to the Iowa line, a place most maps of the age barely bothered to mark. And in one of its plainer cabins, on or about the first day of May, a girl is born into a family that has never once in living memory had quite enough of anything. They name her Martha Jane Cannary. Nobody in that room, and nobody in that town, has the faintest idea that the Mud Street baby crying in the lamplight will end her days as the most famous frontierswoman the West ever produced. Let yourself settle into the plainness of that room for a moment, because it is the beginning of everything. The cabin the Cannaries kept was the ordinary shelter of the poor of that country, a box of rough-sawn logs chinked with mud and straw. A single room doing the work of a whole house, with a packed earth floor swept hard as stone and a fireplace of field rock at one end, where the cooking and the warming and the light all came from the same few flames. A pot hung on an iron crane over the coals. Strings of dried beans and a twist of tallow candles hung from the rafters, and the whole of it carried the mingled smell of wood smoke and grease and damp wool, and the closeness of a family living all together in one warm, dark space through a Missouri winter. Beyond the oiled paper or the one small pane that served for a window lay the raw farmed edge of the prairie, the rail fences and the churned garden plot and the enormous indifferent sky. It was not a poor life by the reckoning of the neighbours, who lived much the same, but it was a life with no soft edges and no margin at all, in which a bad harvest or a sick animal or one more of the father's losing hands could tip the whole household toward real want, and the youngster growing up inside it learned that lesson in her bones long before she could have put it into words. The Cannaries were not the kind of family the county spoke well of. Robert Cannary, the father, was by most accounts a restless, unlucky man with a weakness for the card table, always certain that the next hand or the next stretch of country would set everything right, and always wrong about it. Of Charlotte, the mother, we know far less, which is its own kind of sadness. A woman worn down to a few lines in a census, and a handful of unkind remarks from neighbours who thought her rough. What is clear is that money ran through the Cannary household like water through a cupped hand. There was always a debt, always a plan, always a reason. The plan had not yet come good. And into that unsteady world, Martha Jane arrived as the eldest of what would eventually be 6 children, the girl at the top of the stairs, the one the little ones would learn to look to when the grown-ups could not be relied upon. And the wider world pressing in on that little cabin was not a settled one either. The Missouri of Martha Jane's earliest years was a border state torn down the middle by the great and bitter question of the age, the question of slavery, and it sat cheek by jowl with the Kansas Territory just to the west, where men were already killing one another over whether the new lands would be slave or free. This was the ground that would soon give the coming war its first blood. A youngster of the 1850s in the northern part of that state grew up breathing an air of division and grievance, and gathering violence in a nation quietly loading itself toward the catastrophe that would break over it while she was still small. None of this touched the Canarys directly, so far as anyone can say. They were too poor and too obscure and too busy surviving to leave a mark on the great events. But it is worth holding in mind, because it tells you the temper of the world that made her a hard, unsettled, hopeful country, always on the edge of some upheaval, promising that the real prosperity lay just over the next horizon, and endlessly sending its restless and its ruin streaming westward to look for it. We should sit for a moment in what that childhood actually felt like, because everything she later became grew straight out of it. This was Farm Edge, Missouri in the 1850s, a life measured by weather and chores and the price of things. A girl in that world rose before light to the smell of a cold hearth, carried water, minded her siblings, fed hens, hauled and scrubbed and mended, and learned early that comfort was a thing other people had. There would have been church of a Sunday, and a schoolhouse she attended little and left early, for she never did learn to read or write with any ease, a fact that would follow her all her life and shape the legend, since a woman who cannot write her own story leaves it to others to invent. What she loved from as far back as anyone recalled was the outdoors. The stable more than the parlor, the saddle more than the sampler. She rode almost before she could properly walk, and she rode astride and hard, and the neighbors clicked their tongues, because a girl was not supposed to want the horizon the way Martha Jane wanted it. You can picture her in those first years plainly enough, a rangy, sunburned child forever slipping the leash of the house and the chores, more at home in the paddock than the parlor, happiest with the smell of horse on her hands and dirt on the hem of a dress she had no patience for. She was, by every later account, a tomboy of the most incurable kind, drawn to everything her century marked out as a boy's, the riding and the shooting and the roaming wild along the creek, and impatient to the point of rebellion with the needlework and the deportment and the small, closed world, a daughter of her station was meant to want. In another household, in easier times, that wildness might have been gentled out of her, schooled and corseted and married into something quieter. But the Cannarys had neither the means nor the steadiness to do much shaping, and the country around them rewarded the very qualities the neighbors frowned at, and so the wildness grew unchecked. And the one who would one day be Calamity Jane was, from the very start, precisely herself. It is one of the few genuinely happy things in her whole story, that she seems never to have been made to feel her true nature was a thing to be ashamed of at home, only, later and forever, out in a world that had no place for it. And there is one more thing about those early years that shaped the whole of what followed, and it is the fact of the little ones. Martha Jane was the eldest of 6, which meant that almost from the time she could walk, she was helping to mind the ones below her, and in a poor and unsteady household that duty fell heavier than it would in an easier home. Long before she lost her parents, she was already half a mother to her brothers and sisters, dressing them and minding them, and standing between them and the worst of the family's troubles, and the habit of it went so deep that it never afterward left her. Everything tender in her, all the fierce protective care that would one day send her into a pest house full of dying strangers, was first learned here, in a crowded cabin, looking after children who had no one steadier to look after them. It is worth marking, because the woman the world would remember as a hard-drinking hellion was, underneath, and from the very beginning, a carer, someone whose first and deepest instinct was to gather up whoever needed gathering up and keep them safe. There is one lack from those years that would shape her whole life more than any other, and it is worth dwelling on, because so much flowed from it. Martha Jane never learned to read or write. Schooling on that poor and moving frontier was a patchy occasional thing, and a girl needed at home for chores and child-minding got even less of it than most, and the little she was offered, she seems to have had neither the leisure nor the inclination to take. So she went through her whole life letterless, unable to set down a word or read one back, and the consequences of that ran deeper than mere inconvenience. It meant that when the time came for her story to be told, she could not tell it herself, not on paper, where it would last. She could only speak it, over and over, in saloons and around fires, and watch, helpless, as others wrote it down in whatever shape suited them, inventing and embroidering and selling a Calamity Jane she had no power to correct. The illiteracy that began as a child's misfortune became, in the end, the very reason her true self was lost inside her legend. This is why her early years are so hard to see clearly, and why so much of what is written about them must be hedged with, perhaps, and by some accounts. The Canarys were poor and obscure, and constantly on the move. Exactly the sort of family that leaves almost no mark on the written record, a name in a census here, a mention in a neighbour's recollection there, and little else. Even the plainest facts of her childhood, the year of her birth, the number and names of her brothers and sisters, the exact route the family took, come down to us blurred and disputed, reconstructed long afterward from fragments. It is a strange thing that one of the most famous women the West ever produced should have a beginning so shadowy that scholars still argue over its bones. But it is fitting, in its way. She was born into the great anonymous mass of the frontier poor, the countless nameless souls who crossed the plains and are remembered by no one, and it was only the accident of a nickname and a legend that lifted her out of that oblivion at all, leaving the real girl behind, half lost, in the obscurity she came from. Still, we can picture the shape of that early world, because the farming country of northern Missouri kept its rhythms whoever was poor in it. There was the long green explosion of spring, the creeks running high with snowmelt, and the fields turning from mud to growth almost overnight. There was the heavy heat of the prairie summer, the corn standing tall, the air thick with insects and the smell of warm earth. There was the gold and russet of the autumn, the harvest hurry, the first cold snap. And there was the hard white silence of the winter, when the wind came down unbroken off the plains, and a poor family drew close about its one fire and waited for the light to come back. A child learns the year in her body in a place like that, learns the work each season brings, and the small pleasures too, the swimming hole in July, the first ripe fruit, the barn warm with the breath of animals on a January night. Whatever else was lacking in the Cannary household, and much was, Martha Jane had that, the deep bodily knowledge of the turning year and the open land, and it was the one inheritance the frontier could not take back from her. Her father is a shadowy figure in all this, and not a happy one, but he shaped her by his failures as surely as her mother shaped her by dying. Robert Cannary comes down to us as the type of the frontier drifter, a man forever convinced that fortune waited just over the next rise, at the bottom of the next glass, in the turn of the next card, and forever proved wrong. He moved his family from Missouri to Montana to Utah chasing that mirage, and each move cost them dear, and none of them delivered. From him, perhaps, Martha Jane took the restlessness and the weakness for drink that would dog her all her days, the inability to settle, the sense that somewhere else was always better. But she took something harder and better from his example too, by way of warning. She saw, close up and young, exactly where all that dreaming and drifting and gambling led, and though she could never quite escape the pattern herself, she at least met the hard world head-on and worked for her bread with her own two hands, which was more than her father had ever reliably managed. And want it she did, because want was in the very air of that decade. All around the Canaries, Missouri was a jumping-off place, the last settled ground before the enormous unknown of the plains. Every spring the wagons rolled through, bound for Oregon, for California, for the goldfields that had turned a continent feverish. A child growing up in Princeton watched that river of hope go by year on year, canvas tops swaying west, and absorbed a lesson that would rule her whole restless life, that somewhere out past the edge of the map there was a better country, and that a person only had to be brave enough and hungry enough to go and find it. For a man like Robert Cannary, forever chasing the hand that would finally win, that lesson was irresistible. It was only ever a question of when he would load his own family up and follow the wagons out. When the day finally came to go, it must have been a morning heavy with feeling, though no one thought to record what a poor family felt as it turned its back on everything familiar, To set out on the overland road was to leave for good, to sell or abandon almost all you owned, to say farewell to the graves of your dead and the faces of your neighbours, knowing you would in all likelihood never see any of them again, and to gamble everything on a land you had only heard about in rumours. For the grown-ups, there must have been fear folded inside the hope and grief inside the adventure. But for a restless, horse-mad girl on the edge of her teens, straining against the smallness of her world, the loading of that wagon and the pointing of it west must have felt like the door of a cage swinging open. Ahead lay everything she had ever secretly wanted: distance and danger and the enormous unknown country, and she went toward it, we may be sure, not with dread, but with a fierce and rising joy. Whatever sorrows the road was quietly preparing for her. A wagon train, too, was a whole travelling community, a village on the move, and living inside one for months taught a person a great deal about human beings under strain. There were the captains and the guides who set the pace and settled the disputes, the families with their loaded wagons and their livestock, the single men working their passage, the whole cross-section of the hopeful and the desperate bound together by the shared ordeal of the road. They quarrelled and helped one another by turns, shared what they had in the hard stretches, buried one another's dead, and minded one another's children, and a girl coming up inside that moving society learned early to read people, to know who could be trusted and who could not, to hold her own in a crowd of strangers thrown together by chance. It was a hard schooling in human nature, and Martha Jane never forgot its lessons. All her life she moved easily among the rough and the transient, the drifters and the down and out, because she had learned among them, on the long road west, exactly how such folk lived and what, underneath everything, they needed. That day came in the spring of 1865, with the Great War between the states guttering to its bloody end and the country turning its eyes hungrily westward again. Robert Cannary sold up what little he had, packed his wife and his 6 children into a canvas-topped wagon, and joined a train bound clear across the continent for Virginia City in the newly rich gold territory of Montana. Martha Jane was then about 13, and here, on the long road west, the real making of her began, because the overland journey to Montana was not a holiday and not an adventure out of a storybook. It was 5 months of hard, grinding, dangerous travel across a country that did not care whether you lived, and it demanded of every soul in that train exactly the qualities Martha Jane happened to have in abundance. She took to the trail the way some children take to water, while the other girls in the train kept to the wagons, minding pots and younger ones. She begged and bullied her way in among the men, and the men, amused and then impressed, let her come. She rode ahead with the hunters. She learned to sit a horse across broken ground at a flat gallop and to bring down game for the pot with a rifle held steady. And she was, by the time the wagons reached Montana, reckoned one of the surest shots and boldest riders in the whole company, a girl not yet fully grown, who could outride grown men and was proud to prove it. It is worth pausing on that, because this is the raw ore of the legend. Every tall story later told about Calamity Jane, each dime novel exploit, each scrap of buckskin swagger has its true root here, in a real girl on a real trail, teaching herself to survive in a man's world because no one was going to do the surviving for her. And what a schooling that road was. Imagine the rhythm of it, day upon day for the better part of half a year. The camp stirred before first light, in the grey and the cold, to the sound of the stock being gathered and the smell of coffee and bacon over greenwood fires. The great canvas-topped wagons were loaded and yoked, the oxen leaning grumbling into the traces, and then the long, slow grind of the day's miles began, the wheels groaning, the dust rising in a pale plume that hung over the whole company, the walkers trudging alongside because the loads were too precious to burden with riders. The country unrolled with a slowness that is hard for a modern mind to feel, the same sage flats and the same far blue ridges seeming to hang unchanged for days, the sun hammering down and the wind never ceasing. At the noon halt, the teams were rested and watered where water could be found. At evening, the wagons were drawn into a great ring, a fort of canvas and timber against the dark. The fires were lit, the stock turned out to graze under guard, and sometimes, when the day had not been too cruel, a fiddle came out, and there was a little music under the enormous prairie stars. Into every part of that hard rhythm, Martha Jane threw herself gladly, and it made her, by the journey's end, something the settled world never could have. A true child of the open road. And the road was not gentle in its teaching. The overland trails of that age were strung with hazards that killed the unlucky and the unready by the thousand, and a girl who rode them learned danger young. There were the river crossings, the worst of them, where a swollen current could take a wagon and a team, and everyone clinging to them in a moment, and the whole company would work half a day to ferry the outfit over, hearts in mouths, the water brown and quick and merciless. There were the great sudden storms of the high plains, when the sky went black at noon and the hail came down like stones, and the stock scattered in terror across the grass. There was sickness, always sickness, and accident, a wheel over a foot, a gun mishandled, a fall from a bolting horse. Martha Jane came through all of it, and more than came through, she thrived on it, growing surer and bolder with every mile, until the perils that broke softer travellers had become simply the weather of her world, the ordinary conditions of the only life she wanted. And she was, remember, only one small figure in one of the largest movements of people the world had ever seen. In those middle decades of the century, hundreds of thousands of souls picked up whatever they could carry and set out across the continent on those same rutted trails, drawn west by land and gold and the promise of beginning again in a vast, patient, suffering river of humanity that flowed toward the setting sun. They left a trace of themselves behind them the whole way, discarded furniture too heavy for the grades, the bones of worn-out oxen, and everywhere, at shockingly regular intervals, the graves. The overland roads were lined with the dead, the ones the cholera claimed, the ones the rivers took, the ones the accidents and the fevers and the sheer grinding hardship carried off, buried hastily and abandoned, as the Canarys had left Charlotte behind. Martha Jane grew up inside that great migration and was formed by it, one more child of the wagon roads, and the restlessness it bred in her, the sense that home was always further on, never once loosed its hold to her dying day. But the trail took as much as it gave, and it began by taking the thing she could least spare. Somewhere along that punishing road, as the wagons ground westward through the summer of 1866, Charlotte Cannary, Martha Jane's mother, sickened and died. The most trustworthy accounts say it was pneumonia that carried her off, in a rough camp near a place called Blackfoot, in the Montana country, far from anyone who had ever loved her, and further still from any doctor who might have helped. She was buried where she fell, as thousands were along those westward roads, in ground the family would never see again and would not have been able to find twice if they had tried. And Martha Jane, the eldest, somewhere in her early teens, stood at that raw graveside and became, in a way no child should have to, the woman of the family. We should not hurry past what that dying was, though we will not dwell on the worst of it, because it is the wound at the center of everything. Picture the inside of a jolting wagon out on the Montana road, the canvas glowing dim in the daylight, and a woman laid on the bedding growing weaker by the hour, while the company she is part of cannot stop and cannot help her. There was no doctor to send for, and no town to reach, and no medicine that would have answered. There was only the long, helpless watching, the fever and the failing breath, the children kept close or kept away, and the father, useless as ever in a crisis, standing by. When it was over, the burial was the burial of the trail, the same rite that had been performed over so many others along those westward roads. A grave dug quickly in ground the family would leave behind within the hour, a few words said, a marker the prairie would swallow within a season. Martha Jane, still barely into her teens, watched her mother lowered into the earth of a country she had never wished to cross, and then climbed back up onto the wagon seat, because the train was already rolling, and the little ones were already crying, and there was, as there would be for the rest of her days, no one else to do it. Try to feel the size of that loss for a girl of her age, out in the middle of a continent, with 5 younger children looking up at her, and a father who had never in his life managed to hold anything steady. There was no time to grieve properly, no soft room to grieve in. The wagons had to roll on, because a train did not wait, and the living had to be fed. So Martha Jane wiped her face and got up onto the wagon seat and drove and cooked and hushed the little ones through the nights, and kept the whole fragile enterprise moving toward Montana while her own heart was a fresh wound. If you ever wonder where the hardness came from, the drinking, the swagger, the reckless disregard for what people thought of her, do not look for it in her wildness. Look for it here, at a nameless grave beside a westward road, in a motherless girl of 13 learning that the world would not stop to let her feel things, and deciding, without ever putting it into words, that she would simply have to be tough enough to bear it. The Canarys reached the Montana goldfields, but they did not find their fortune there, for the Canaries never found their fortune anywhere. Virginia City in those years was a boom town in the fullest sense, a crooked run of saloons and stores and claims thrown up almost overnight in a gulch where gold had been struck, loud and lawless and crammed with men who had come from everywhere on earth to get rich or die trying. It was no place to raise 5 grieving children, and Robert Cannary, widowed and adrift, and no better with money than he had ever been, soon gave it up. Within a season or so, he had gathered his family once more and turned them south down the long road towards Salt Lake City in the Utah Territory, where he meant, so the story goes, to try his hand at last at honest farming on a stretch of open ground. It was the kind of fresh start he had promised 100 times. And like all the others, it did not hold. The Montana she reached was the raw frontier at its most feverish. Virginia City and the diggings around it had erupted out of the wilderness within a couple of years of the first strike, and by the time the Canaries arrived, it was a churning, muddy, lantern-lit warren of a place. Wooden stores and saloons crammed along a gulch that had been silent wilderness a season or two before. The hills around it torn and sluiced and stripped bare in the frenzy of the search. Gold dust was the common coin, weighed out on the counter for a drink or a meal. Men outnumbered women many times over. The law was a rough and improvised thing, and hard trouble came quick and casual. For a widowed father with 6 children and no gift for holding on to money, it was no place to build anything, and Robert Cannary seems to have known it. So the family turned south once more, back onto the road, that endless road that had already cost them so much, and made the long haul down toward the Utah valleys, chasing one more fresh start in a run of years that had never once delivered on the promise of any of them. They came down into the valley of the Great Salt Lake in the summer, into the strange, ordered world the Latter-day Saints had built out of the desert, a place utterly unlike the raucous mining camps, with its irrigated fields and its wide, clean streets and its air of a community that meant to stay. Robert took up a patch of land and set his children to the endless work of turning ground. And for a little while, the Canaries had something almost like a home. But the father was already a spent man. Whether it was illness or drink or simply the accumulated exhaustion of a life that had never once broken his way, Robert Cannary did not last long in Utah. In the year 1867, barely more than a 12-month after burying his wife on the Montana road, he died too, and left his children with nothing at all except each other and the wide, indifferent country all around them. The valley they came down into must have felt like another country altogether, and in a sense it was. Where the mining camps were chaos, the settlement the Latter-day Saints had raised beside the Great Salt Lake was order made visible. A city laid out in broad straight streets on a careful grid, ringed by irrigated fields green against the desert, built by a people who had come to that harsh basin to stay, and had bent it ditch by ditch and wall by wall, to their will. For a family that had known nothing but motion and loss, there must have been something almost unbearably tempting in all that settledness, that proof that people could put down roots in hard ground and make them hold. But the Canaries were not of that community and had no real place in it, and the father was already burning down to his last reserves. When he died there, in that ordered valley, so soon after the mother, he left his children stranded in the middle of a settled world that was not theirs, orphaned and penniless, and far from anyone who owed them a thing, with nothing between them and ruin but the will of a teenaged girl who had already buried both her parents beside 2 different roads. And so, before she was old enough to be called a woman by any reckoning of the age, Martha Jane Cannary was an orphan twice over, standing at the head of a family of children in a territory where she knew almost no one, with no money, no letters, no trade, and no one on earth to turn to. What she did next is the truest and least celebrated heroism of her entire life, and it is where we will go from here, out of the ordered valley of Salt Lake and onto the hard road north. into the raw frontier world that would forge the girl called Martha Jane into the legend called Calamity. And here we must let go of the brothers and sisters she had fought so hard to keep, because the record lets go of them too, and there is a quiet sorrow in that. For a while, in those first orphaned years, Martha Jane held the little family together by main force, mothering them and working for them and dragging them from town to town in her wake. But 5 children are a great weight for a girl barely more than a child to carry through a hard country, and one by one, in ways the sources do not clearly tell, they slipped out of her keeping and out of the story altogether. Some were surely taken in by families, some placed out, some simply grew and scattered into lives of their own that history did not think to follow. Whatever became of them, they vanish from her tale, and she goes on alone, and we are left to imagine what it cost her to lose, a second time, the family she had already saved once. The mothering instinct that drove her the rest of her days may owe as much to that second loss as to the first, the ache of arms that had been full of children and were suddenly empty. Where exactly Martha Jane took her brothers and sisters in those first orphaned months, the records do not entirely agree, but the shape of it is plain enough. She loaded what the family owned onto a wagon, gathered the 5 younger children around her, and set off north and east out of Utah into the Wyoming territory, following the only roads a friendless girl could follow, which were the roads that ran toward work. He fetched up in places with names like Fort Bridger and Piedmont, rough way stations strung along the routes where the Transcontinental Railroad was being hammered west across the plains, and she did the only thing there was to do. She found work, any work, whatever a friendless young woman with strong hands and no schooling and a wagon full of hungry children could talk her way into. And so began the long apprenticeship in survival that fills the years the legend likes to skip over. She washed dishes in eating houses. She cooked over other people's fires. She waited tables in the plank-walled hotels that sprang up wherever the rail crews paused. She minded the sick and nursed where nursing was wanted, and she drove ox teams, and she took a turn dancing in the halls that separated railroad men from their pay of an evening. It was a hard, hand-to-mouth existence lived among hard people, and we should be honest about it, because honesty is the only real respect you can pay a life like hers. On that frontier, a woman entirely alone, with no husband, no father, no property, and no letters, had almost nothing standing between herself and disaster. The labor open to her was rough, and some of it, in the leaner stretches, was the oldest and least spoken of trade of all, the one that friendless women were forever pushed toward when the other doors closed. The plainest accounts place her, for a time in the 1870s, among the women who sold what they had to sell in the shadow of the frontier forts. There is no need to dress that up, and no call to dwell on it. It is simply the truth of what the country did to a girl, had orphaned, and left to fend for a family of children on her own. Set yourself down for a moment in the ordinary hardness of those working days, because the legend never shows them, and they are where the real woman lived. Picture the kitchen of a plank-walled eating house on the railroad line, the heat and the grease and the clatter, a girl scrubbing pots in water gone cold and grey, her hands raw and her feet aching, on them from before dawn until long after dark, for a wage that barely kept her and the young ones she was feeding. Picture the dance halls of an evening, smoky and loud, where she was paid to keep the rail hands drinking and turning about the floor, and where the line between ordinary rowdiness and real danger was thin and always shifting. Picture the rail camps themselves, raw townlets of tents and shanties that sprang up at the end of the track and vanished when the track moved on, full of men far from home with money in their pockets and nothing to spend it on but drink and cards and company. This was the world Martha Jane came up in, not the clean open range of the storybooks, but the grimy, transient, hand-to-mouth underside of the frontier boom. And she survived it not by being lucky, but by being tougher and quicker and harder to frighten than almost anyone around her. Much of this early roaming turned on the forts, those scattered military posts that were the only fixed points in a vast and empty country, and it is worth knowing what sort of place they were, because she spent years in their orbit. A frontier fort was not only soldiers. Around each one grew a rough attendant settlement, a cluster of traders and teamsters and laundresses and camp followers and hangers-on, all making a living off the army's presence. And it was in that fringe society that a woman alone could find work and shelter and a kind of company. The forts hired teamsters to haul their supplies and scouts to guide their columns and hands to do their endless labor, and they drew to themselves exactly the drifting, rootless, hard-used population that Martha Jane belonged to. She knew that world intimately, its rhythms and its dangers and its small mercies, and she moved through it for years, now near one post and now near another, always working, always moving, a familiar rough figure in the shadow of the flag. And running alongside the forts, in those same years, was the other great engine of the changing West, the railroad, and she moved through that world too. The transcontinental line was being driven across the plains and mountains in a feat of brutal, relentless labor, and where it went, it threw up its own rough towns. Towns like Rawlins in the Wyoming country, end-of-track settlements of tents and shanties that boomed and roared for a season, and then quieted as the rails moved on. These were hard, transient, overwhelmingly male camps, full of graders and tie cutters and track layers with money to burn and little to spend it on, and they offered a woman like Martha Jane both work and danger in equal measure. She took the work, whatever it was, and endured the danger, and watched, without perhaps quite understanding it, as the iron road she labored beside stitched the wild country, shut behind her, bringing on, mile by mile, the settled and orderly world that would have no place at all for a woman like her. We are lucky to know, at least, roughly what she looked like in her prime, because a handful of photographs of her survive, and they are worth studying, for they show a person the legend never quite prepared you for. The best known shows her in fringed buckskin, a rifle standing at her side, and the face above the collar is not the pretty dime novel heroine at all, but something far more interesting, weathered and strong-boned and level-eyed, the face of a woman who has been out in all weathers and expects no favors. She was tall and sturdily built, plain rather than handsome, and she wore her hardihood openly, without apology, in the set of her shoulders and the directness of her gaze. There is nothing coy in those pictures, and nothing soft. And yet, if you look a moment longer, there is something else there too, behind the toughness, a kind of guardedness, a weariness about the eyes, the look of a person long used to being stared at, and judged and found wanting, braced against it even before the shutter falls. The armor is on in every photograph, but you can just make out, underneath it, the woman it was built to protect. Those who met her in the flesh tended to remember the same handful of things, and together they draw a vivid portrait. They remembered the language first, the astonishing, inventive, unstoppable profanity that could make a mule skinner blush, delivered in a loud voice with evident relish. They remembered the drinking and the swagger and the readiness to take offense and to answer it. And then, almost always, they remembered the other thing, the sudden startling kindness, the open hand, the way the fearsome creature would turn in an instant into the gentlest of nurses, or the softest touch for a hard-luck story in the whole camp. She was, everyone agreed, a bundle of contradictions, coarse and tender, alarming and endearing, generous to a fault and reckless past all sense, and she left almost no one who encountered her indifferent. People laughed at her and were exasperated by her, and now and then were a little afraid of her, but a surprising number of them, when they came to speak of her afterward, did so with something that can only be called affection. Her way with money was of a piece with all the rest of her, open-handed to the point of folly. When she had it, which was seldom and briefly, she spent it as fast as it came, on drink and on small treats and, above all, on other people, standing rounds for the house and pressing coins on anyone who seemed to need them more than she did, which was nearly everyone. She could no more hold on to $1 than hold on to a happy season, and the two failings sprang from the same root, a nature that lived entirely in the present, that had never known security, and so never learned to save for a future it did not really believe in. It made her beloved, and it kept her poor, and she seems to have counted the trade a fair one. There is a kind of freedom in it, even a kind of grace, this refusal to hoard against the cold, though it left her, again and again, with nothing, and the cold came anyway. She gave her money away, as she gave everything away, her labour, her nursing, her heart, holding nothing back and keeping nothing safe. and it is one more reason the people who knew her forgave her so much. And she was, to the end of her days, almost entirely without fear, in a way that the people around her found equal parts thrilling and alarming. She would ride country, others would not ride, cross water, others would not cross, walk into a brawl or a sick room or a burning building with the same flat disregard for her own safety, as though her life were a thing she valued too little to guard. Some of that was courage of the truest kind, the readiness to put herself between danger and someone weaker. Some of it, in the darker reading, was the recklessness of a person who had lost so much so young that her own survival had stopped seeming to matter very much even to her. The two are hard to tell apart, and perhaps in her they were never really separate. What is certain is that the fearlessness was real and lifelong, and that it carried her, again and again, into places a more careful soul would have shunned, and out again, until at last the one enemy she could not outface, the slow one she carried within her, brought her down where no danger ever had. What is remarkable is not that the frontier ground her down. The frontier ground almost everyone down. What is remarkable is that through all of it she kept the little ones fed and together as long as she could, and that she came through it not broken but hardened, not cowed but bold, with a way of walking into a room full of rough men, as though she had every right to be there and would knock down anyone who suggested otherwise. Somewhere in those years of dishwater and dust and hard company, the shy edges were burned off Martha Jane Cannary for good, and in its place grew the loud, profane, fearless, quick-tempered creature the West would come to know. She learned to drink with the men and swear with the men and hold her own with the men, because holding her own was the only protection she had, and a reputation for being dangerous to cross was worth more to a woman alone than any amount of ladylike virtue. It was in this same restless period that she made the choice that more than anything else set her apart, the choice that turned a poor orphan girl into an American original. Martha Jane began more and more of the time to dress and to work as a man. She put aside skirts for trousers, buttoned herself into a man's shirt and coat, pulled on boots and a broad hat, and hired herself out for the kind of hard-paid work that no eating house or dance hall could match. The work of the teamster and the bull whacker and the mule skinner, hauling freight across the plains behind straining teams. Understand first the plain economics of it, because there is nothing mysterious there. Men's labour paid, and women's barely did. A girl who could pass, more or less, as a young man, and who could handle a team as well as any of them, could earn in a week what a dance hall wage came to in a month, and could do it without selling anything she did not wish to sell. For a woman keeping herself and 5 siblings fed, that arithmetic was reason enough. But it was never only the money, and anyone who has looked closely at her life comes away certain of that. Martha Jane took to men's clothes and men's trades with a relish that went far beyond necessity. She was, by temperament, ill-suited to every single thing her century expected of a woman, and she seemed to breathe easier the moment she stepped out of the role she had been born into. In trousers on a wagon box, with a whip in her hand and a team of oxen leaning into the traces ahead of her, she was not a scandal, and not a problem, and not a poor orphan girl to be pitied or married off. She was simply a good hand, judged by what she could do, and what she could do was considerable. She could crack a bullwhacker's whip, a fearsome braided thing that ran to some 30 feet and more, with a report like a pistol shot, guiding a team of a dozen oxen through mud and river and mountain passed by the sound of it alone. She could mend harness and grease an axle, and swim a wagon across a swollen ford. She hired on as well with the crews driving the railroad west, and she took the men's wages and asked no quarter, and gave none. To understand what a good hand she truly was, you have to understand the work itself, because bullwhacking was a genuine and demanding craft, and she was, by every account, expert at it. A freight team was not a horse and cart. It was a long string of oxen, 6 or 8, or a dozen and more, hitched in pairs to a heavy wagon, or a chain of them loaded with tons of goods bound for some distant camp, and moving it across the broken country of the plains was slow, brutal, skilled labour. The driver walked, mostly, alongside the team, and governed it not with reins, but with the voice and the lash, cracking that braided whip like gunfire over the ears of the lead animals without ever laying it on their hides. She had to read the ground, pick the fords and the grades, nursed the loads through mud that swallowed a wheel to the axle, and up slopes that had the oxen bawling in the traces. She had to mend what broke, doctor what sickened, and keep it all moving day after day through weather that ran from blistering heat to killing cold. It was among the hardest labour the frontier offered, and Martha Jane did it as well as the men who had done it all their lives, and took her pay for it, and asked no allowances of anyone. The sight of her must have startled a good many strangers, and the reactions ran the full range from amusement to outrage to a wary respect. A woman in men's clothes was a genuine scandal to the respectable of the age, an affront to everything their world believed about how the sexes should look and behave, and Martha Jane drew hard looks and harder words wherever such people gathered. But out on the freight roads and in the rough camps, where a hand was judged by the work and not the wardrobe, the scandal mattered a great deal less, and there she was taken more or less on her merits, which were considerable. She gave as good as she got in any exchange of insults, and better, for she had a tongue that could blister paint and a temper that made men think twice. And the combination of real competence and evident willingness to fight meant that she was, for the most part, left alone to do her work. She had made herself, by sheer force of character, into something the frontier had almost no other category for, a woman who lived by a man's labour and answered to no one, and she guarded that hard-won independence fiercely. There is a photograph of her from later years, in her buckskins, and you can read the whole story of these frontier decades in the set of her jaw and the way she holds her rifle as if it were an ordinary tool of an ordinary trade, which for her it was. She was tall for a woman of the age, broad through the shoulder, weathered brown by 10,000 miles of open road, and she carried herself with the rolling, ready ease of someone who had spent her life outdoors and expected trouble and was equal to it. People who met her in these years and did not know her sometimes took her for a young man at first glance, and she did not always trouble to correct them. It suited her to move through the world a size larger and a degree more dangerous than the truth. On a frontier where a woman on her own was fair game, a lone bullwhacker who might be a man and might be armed, and was certainly not to be trifled with, could travel roads that no ordinary traveller dared. We do her a disservice, though, if we let the buckskins and the swagger hide the person underneath, because the tenderness was always there, folded up small and kept out of sight the way she had learned to keep it since her mother died. The same person who could outcurse a mule train would again and again across her life stop whatever she was doing to nurse a stranger through fever, to stand up for a beaten animal, to press her last coins on someone worse off than herself. The hardness was a shell she had grown because the world had given her no choice, and everyone who ever got past it said the same thing afterward, in one form or another, that under all the noise there was a great, aching, generous heart that had simply never been given anywhere safe to spend itself. Hold on to that, because it is the key to everything sad that is coming, and it is the reason a hard-living frontier teamster spent the back half of her life fixed on one impossible love and asked, at the very end, only to be laid down beside him. There is a small story from those freighting days that shows the tenderness plainly, and it is worth telling because it is so entirely of a piece with everything else we know of her. She was on the trail one time with a pack train hauling army supplies, so the account goes, when one of the mules went down under its load, and its driver, losing his temper, set about the fallen animal with his heavy boots, kicking it and cursing it where it lay. Calamity Jane bore it as long as she could, and then she could bear it no longer, and she rounded on the man and warned him, in no uncertain terms, not to kick that mule again. It is a tiny thing, an ordinary act of decency on a hard road, and it never made a dime novel, and yet it tells you more about the true grain of her than all the invented heroics put together. She could not stand to see a helpless creature abused. The same instinct that sent her to the sick beds sent her to the defense of a beaten mule, and it ran, unbroken, through the whole of her rough and generous heart. Her way with animals was in truth one of the surest of all her skills, and it went hand in hand with the physical hardiness that let her live a man's life on the frontier. She understood horses and mules and oxen the way only someone raised among them can, could gentle a frightened animal, or read a lame one, or coax a balky team over a bad stretch of road. And she trusted her own body in the saddle, and on the box with an ease that few could match. She could ride all day and sleep on the ground and rise to do it again. She could shoot straight and handle a whip, drive a team and swim a river and mend what needed mending. And she carried herself through all of it with the unforced physical confidence of a person entirely at home in her own strength. In an age that wanted its women delicate and dependent, she was neither, and the animals she worked with, at least, never held it against her. With them, as with the sick and the friendless, she was simply and wholly herself, and they seemed to know it. Before we follow her onto the road that led at last to the Black Hills and to that man, there is one more thing we have to settle, because you cannot tell this story without it. Somewhere in these hard-scrabble Wyoming years, out among the forts and the freight roads and the railroad camps, Martha Jane Cannary stopped being Martha Jane at all. The country gave her a new name, a name that would blaze across 1,000 newspapers and dime novels and outlive her by more than a century. They started calling her Calamity Jane, and exactly how she came by it is a small mystery in itself, one worth stopping over, because the tangle of stories around a single nickname turns out to be the whole legend in miniature. The trouble with the name is that she herself gave one answer, and almost nobody who knew her believed it. In the little life story she dictated in her later years, she told a stirring tale of soldiering out of Fort Russell in the Wyoming country, of a campaign against the tribes of the plains, of an officer named Egan whose command was ambushed on the return march. As the fighting broke, so she said, Captain Egan was hit and reeling in the saddle, and Martha Jane, riding at the rear, spurred back through the danger, caught him as he fell, and swung him up onto her own horse to carry him to safety. And when the captain recovered, she said, he looked at the woman who had saved him and laughed and named her on the spot. Calamity Jane, he called her, the heroine of the plains. It is a wonderful story. It has the shape of exactly the tale a person would invent who could not write and had learned, out of long practice, that a good tale told well was worth a drink and a warm corner on a cold night. And there is very little reason to think a word of it is true. The plainer explanations are less flattering, and for that reason, rather more convincing. Some who knew her said she earned the name the hard way, by being a walking piece of bad luck, a woman around whom calamity gathered as reliably as flies to a fair. Trouble followed her, or she followed trouble, and the two were seldom far apart. One old frontier hand put it that if she so much as sat down on a fence rail, the rail would somehow contrive to buck her off. A newspaper of the day, reaching for the same idea, wrote that she had a gift for stirring up a commotion at any time or place, and on the shortest of notice, and that the name simply stuck to the commotion. Others, less kind still, said the calamity in question was the calamity that tended to befall the men who took up with her, a joke at her expense that says more about the men than about her. Whatever the true root, the name had fastened itself to Martha Jane by the middle of the 1870s. And here is the telling thing. She loved it. The honest truth is that the origin of the name is simply lost, and probably always will be. And that too is fitting for a woman whose whole story lives in the fog between fact and tale. Perhaps a grateful officer really did christen her on a battlefield, though the evidence is thin to vanishing. Perhaps she truly was a magnet for misfortune, a woman around whom accidents and quarrels and disasters seemed forever to cluster, until the name attached itself as a plain description. Perhaps it was a cruel joke about the trouble she brought to the men who kept her company, hardened over time into something she chose to wear with pride. Very likely the name grew, as such names do, out of some tangle of all these things, a word that fit her from several directions at once, and stuck because it fit. What is certain is only the end result, that by the middle of the 1870s the name had swallowed the woman, that Martha Jane Cannary had become Calamity Jane in the mouths of everyone who spoke of her, and that she, far from resenting the loss of her own plain name, embraced its bright and dangerous replacement with open arms. She did not fight the name or resent it or try to live it down. She seized it with both hands and wore it like a badge of honor, because Martha Jane Cannary was a poor illiterate orphan whom the world had every intention of overlooking, and Calamity Jane was somebody. That name got written up in the newspapers. It turned heads when she rode into a camp. A name like that was capital, the only capital a friendless woman on the frontier was ever likely to accumulate, and she spent it lavishly for the rest of her days. In that single choice to take the world's half-mocking nickname and make it a crown, you can see the whole shrewd, wounded, defiant spirit of her. If they were going to talk about her anyway, and they were, then by heaven they would talk about her on her own terms. The legend she built was, in a real sense, a one great creative work, and she began building it here, in the freight roads and forts of Wyoming, long before the wider world had ever heard her name. It helps to remember what the making of a frontier name actually was in those years, because it explains how a poor illiterate teamster could become a household word. This was the great age of the cheap press and the dime novel, when Eastern publishers were pouring out a flood of lurid, thrilling, wildly embroidered tales of the vanishing West to a public that could not get enough of them, and when every little frontier newspaper traded gleefully in local colour and tall talk. A striking character, a good nickname, a handful of quotable exploits, real or invented, could travel astonishingly far and fast through that hungry machinery. A name printed in one paper was copied into the next and swelled a little in the copying, and reached at last the desks of the dime novelists back east, who needed exactly such raw material and were not fussy about the facts. Calamity Jane, loud and colourful, and quotable, and genuinely capable, was made for that machine. She could not read a line of what was written about her, but she understood, with a shrewd instinct, that the name and the reputation were worth having, and she fed them both. The telling and retelling her stories to anyone who would listen and letting them grow with every telling. And the name, once it had truly taken hold, became a kind of armour as well as a kind of currency. To be Calamity Jane was to be known, and to be known was, for a woman alone on a dangerous frontier, a form of protection. A stranger who might have troubled an anonymous woman thought twice about troubling one whose name was in the papers, one reputed to shoot as quick as any man, and to give no ground in a quarrel. She played up to that reputation deliberately, because it served her, cultivating the swagger and the loud talk and the readiness to fight until the performance and the person were hard to tell apart even for her. Somewhere in there, under the character she had built, the frightened orphaned girl still lived. But the character kept that girl safe, and fed her, and gave her a place in the world, and Calamity Jane wore it, in the end, almost all the time. It was the only suit of armour she could afford, and she never took it off in public again. But armour worn long enough becomes a cage as well as a shield, and the name that protected her also, in time, imprisoned her. For there were, in the end, two people sharing one body, the loud, hard, legendary Calamity Jane the public demanded to see, and the quieter, more wounded self underneath, and the age had no interest whatever in the second of them. It wanted the character, the swaggering frontier original of the newspapers, and it was to the character that people bought their drinks and their booklets, so that the more famous she grew, the more she had to be Calamity, performing herself, living up to the reputation, keeping the private self ever more hidden away. Somewhere in that long performance the two grew hard to separate even for her, until it is a fair question whether, toward the end, she quite knew where the legend stopped and the person began. She had made herself unforgettable by inventing a self the world would remember. The price of it was that the self she was born with slipped further out of sight with each passing year, until hardly anyone, perhaps least of all she herself, could quite find it anymore. The stage on which that legend would truly take shape was already being set, far to the north and east, in a range of pine-dark mountains that rose out of the plains like an island. The white men called them the Black Hills. To the Lakota, whose land they were by solemn treaty, they were Paha Sapa, the sacred heart of everything. Ground promised to them for as long as the grass should grow and the rivers run. And then, in the summer of 1874, an army expedition into those forbidden hills came back with word that changed everything and doomed the promise. There was gold in the Black Hills, gold in the grass roots, thick in the streams, riches enough to set the whole exhausted, war-weary nation ablaze with one last great rush. The treaty did not survive the news. It rarely did. Within a year, prospectors were pouring illegally into the sacred hills by the thousand. The army was mounting expeditions to survey the country, and by turns to hold the miners back and to sweep the way clear for them, and the northern plains were sliding toward the war that would end. The following summer, on the grassy ridges above a river, the Lakota called the Greasy Grass, and the army called the Little Bighorn. Hold in your mind before we go up into them what the Black Hills actually were, because it matters to everything that happened there. Rising dark and forested out of the pale surrounding plains, they were an island of cool pine and clear water and sheltered valleys in a sea of open grass. And to the Lakota they were not merely useful land but holy land, the sacred center of the world, a place of vision and burial and the deepest meaning guaranteed to them in writing by the government of the United States. To ride up into them out of the baking flats was to enter another and gentler world, the air suddenly resinous with pine, the light falling green through the timber, streams running cold and quick over the stones. It was, and is, one of the loveliest reaches of the whole West, and it was precisely this beloved and sacred and legally protected place that the discovery of gold turned almost overnight into the object of a lawless national stampede, so that the very ground beneath the boomtown Martha Jane was riding toward was ground taken in plain breach of a solemn promise, beautiful and stolen in the same breath. The rush that poured into that stolen country was a frenzy of a kind that is hard now to picture. The word of gold went out across a country still exhausted and impoverished by its great war, and it acted on the desperate and the hopeful like a fever. From every direction they came, by the thousand and then the tens of thousands, on foot and on horseback and by wagon, gamblers and farmers and out-of-work soldiers and immigrants fresh off the boats, all of them chasing the same dream of the strike that would remake their lives. They came knowing the hills were forbidden and came anyway, for a hungry man does not much heed a treaty, and the army that was meant to keep them out found itself by turns escorting them in. Into this vast, lawless, hopeful, heedless human tide rode Martha Jane, one more restless soul among a multitude of them, all streaming toward the same narrow gulch where the richest diggings had been found, the raw new town that everyone was suddenly talking about, the place called Deadwood. Into this gathering storm rode Calamity Jane, and this is where the true and the tall finally braid together past all untangling. What seems solidly established is that in the year 1875, she attached herself to a government surveying party, the Newton and Jenny expedition, sent to map the Black Hills and weigh its riches, and that she travelled with it into that wild and contested country. The following year, 1876, she was on the move again with the military columns fanning out across the northern plains, in the orbit, for a time, of General Crook's command as it marched toward the campaign against the Lakota and the Cheyenne. She served, in the loose way of the frontier, as a kind of scout, teamster, and camp follower, hauling and cooking and riding dispatch, and she went, as she so often did, in the clothes of a man, which on these military expeditions was more than habit. It was cover. A woman was not supposed to be there at all, and Martha Jane in a soldier's coat could ride with the column and share its fires and pass, at a distance, as one more trooper among many. There is something worth pausing on in the picture of her riding with those columns, because it is the truest image we have of her in her element. Imagine the military camp at dusk on the northern plains, the picketed horses, the smell of wood smoke and coffee and leather, the rows of canvas tents, the men cleaning gear and swapping talk around the fires as the enormous prairie dark comes down, and moving among them at ease in that rough masculine world in a way she was never quite at ease anywhere else. A weathered figure in a soldier's coat and a broad hat, taking her turn at the work, holding her own in the talk, one of the outfit. She was not playing at it. She could ride the long days, handle the teams, carry a message through dangerous country, and bed down hard and rise early without complaint. And the men who shared those camps with her, whatever they privately made of her, could not deny that she pulled her weight. For a woman who had never in her life been allowed simply to belong anywhere, those expeditions offered something close to it, a place in a company, a job to do, and the wide clean land all around, and it is little wonder she kept going back to that existence, for as long as her body would let her. And the country those columns rode through was, for all the grim purpose of the marching, achingly beautiful, and she cannot have been blind to it. To come up out of the parched and endless grass of the plains into the cool green shade of the Black Hills was to enter a kind of paradise, the tall pines whispering overhead, the air sharp and sweet with resin, clear streams running cold over the stones, and the light falling dappled through the timber onto the needle-strewn ground. There were meadows starred with flowers in the high summer, and deer moving quiet at the wood's edge at dusk, and a stillness under the trees that the noisy world of the camps could not reach. For a woman whose whole existence had been hard travel and rough towns, and the constant grind of getting by, those weeks in the high pine country must have offered a rare taste of peace, a beauty freely given that asked nothing of her. And it is easy to understand why the Black Hills, of all the wide west she wandered, became the one place her heart would always call home. The wider country she crossed to reach those hills was a wilder and more teeming place then than we can easily picture now, and she knew it in a way almost no one living does anymore. In her girlhood, the great buffalo herds still moved across the plains in numbers past counting, a living brown flood that could take days to pass and made the ground tremble with its going. There were antelope in their thousands, and wolves, and the vast flocks of birds, and the whole immense prairie teeming with life still more or less intact, though the killing had already begun that would strip it bare within her own lifetime. She rode through all of it in its last great age, hunted it and lived off it, and took it for the permanent order of the world, as everyone did, never guessing how fast it would go. To have seen the plains as she saw them, dark with buffalo under an enormous sky, is a thing no one will ever see again, and she carried that vanished world in her memory to the end, one more lost country among the many she had loved and outlived. It is worth being clear-eyed for a moment about what these expeditions were, because the sleepy glamour of the Wild West legend can hide it. The columns Calamity Jane rode with were instruments of a hard national purpose, the taking of the northern plains from the peoples who lived there, and the road she travelled ran straight through other people's homeland and other people's grief. She was not a general or a policymaker. She was a poor woman, earning wages the only way open to her. On the moving edge of an advance, she had no power to start or stop. But the country she crossed was contested ground in the fullest and most sorrowful sense, and the gold town she was riding toward, the town where her legend would finally catch fire, stood on land that had been sacred and promised and was now simply taken. We can love the human story of Martha Jane and still hold that larger truth steady in the same hand. Both are true, and the frontier was made of exactly such tangles. Her time with the columns did not last, and the reason tells you something about the tightrope she walked. By the accounts that come down to us, her disguise was eventually penetrated, her sex discovered, and she was, in the way of such things, sent back, no longer able to ride with the soldiers once it was known she was a woman among them. It was the eternal problem of her life in miniature. She could do the work as well as any man, could ride and scout and endure alongside them, and yet the moment the fact of what she was came to light, the door was closed to her, not for any failure of ability, but for the simple accident of her sex. That summer of 1876, while she was drifting on the edge of the campaign, the war on the northern plains was building toward its terrible climax, the one that would end on the Little Bighorn with the destruction of Custer and his command, a shock that would harden the whole nation's resolve to break the plains peoples for good. She was near the great events without being of them, as she so often was, a bit player on the edge of history's stage, making her way, as ever, toward the next place that might take her in. By the early summer of 1876, the illegal rush had thrown up, in a narrow gulch deep in the Black Hills, one of the most notorious boom towns the West ever produced. It had no legal right to exist, sitting as it did on treaty land, which meant it had no law worth the name, and no government and no restraint, only gold and the men who came for it. It was called Deadwood, after the dead timber standing grey on the slopes above it, and it was to Deadwood, in the middle of that fateful summer, that Calamity Jane now turned her horse. She did not ride in alone. She rode in as part of a wagon train coming up from Fort Laramie, a train that carried, among its rough and colourful company, one man whose name was already a legend across the whole of America, a man whose brief and glittering path was about to cross hers and change the shape of her story for good. His name was James Butler Hickok. The world knew him as Wild Bill. The road that brought them together ran north from Fort Laramie, that great weathered way station on the old overland trail where the traffic of half the West seemed to pass through sooner or later, and it was there, by the most credible accounts, that Martha Jane fell in with the company that would carry her into history. It was a colourful outfit, got up by a frontier character named Charlie Utter, Colorado Charlie, a dapper and capable man who ran a freight and express line into the hills, and it gathered up, as such trains did, a rolling assortment of miners and gamblers and adventurers and hangers-on all bound for the new diggings. And riding with it, on his own way to Deadwood to try his failing luck at the tables, was the most famous man on the frontier. Picture the moment she first took him in, this tall, long-haired figure in buckskin and broadcloth with the drooping moustache and the reputation that went before him like a herald, the living legend she had surely heard of 100 times around 100 fires. Whatever passed between them on that road north, and we cannot truly know, it fixed something in her that would never afterward come loose. She rode into Deadwood beside Wild Bill Hickok, and some part of her never rode out again. What a company that was to arrive in, and what an arrival it must have been. Charlie Utter's train came down into the gulch in the fullness of the rush, and it carried a cast of characters that a novelist would have hesitated to invent, the famous and the infamous, and the merely colourful all jolting along together toward the diggings. There was Utter himself, trim and particular even on the trail, and his brother, and the gamblers, and the fancy women, and the hard cases, and at the centre of it, the towering figure of Wild Bill, and somewhere in the dust and the noise a weathered woman in buckskin who had lately joined them and meant to make the most of it. When they rolled into Deadwood, the town took notice, as a town like that always took notice of new blood and new money, and above all, of a genuine celebrity in its midst. Two legends came down that street together in the summer of the rush, and the Gulch, which had a keen instinct for a good story, would remember it long after both of them were gone. To understand what Wild Bill Hickok meant, both to the country and to Martha Jane, you have to understand that by the summer of 1876, he was already more legend than man. Born James Butler Hickok in Illinois in 1837, he had come west as a young man and built, across the violent middle decades of the century, a reputation that towered over almost everyone else on the frontier. He had been a stagecoach driver, a Union scout in the war, a lawman in the wildest of the Kansas cowtowns, and a gunfighter whose real and rumored killings had been multiplied and burnished by every newspaper and dime novel in America, until nobody, very possibly including Hickok himself, could say for certain where the truth left off and the myth began. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with long hair worn to his shoulders and a sweeping moustache, and he dressed with a dandy's care, and when he walked into a room, the room knew it. He was, in short, the single most glamorous figure on the whole frontier, the living embodiment of everything the word gunslinger conjured. But the Wild Bill, who rode into the Black Hills that summer, was a man on the far downward slope of his fame, and this is the part the legend tends to leave out. His eyes were failing him, clouded by disease, so that the deadliest pistol shot in the West could no longer see across a street with certainty. A private terror for a man who had stayed alive by being faster and sharper than everyone around him. The lawman's badges were behind him. He drifted now from town to town, making his living at the card table, and not always making it well. And more than once the law had moved him along as a vagrant. He had come to Deadwood for the plainest and most human of reasons, the same reason as every other soul in that gulch. He was hoping to strike it rich, to make one last great score in the goldfields, so that he could go home and provide for the woman he had just married. Picture the world his last months actually moved through, because it was a smaller and sadder world than the legend allows. The great gunfighter spent his Deadwood days and nights in the smoky saloons along the gulch, at the green bays of the poker tables, trying to make a stake that only lay way left to a man whose reputation had outlived its usefulness. He was watchful still, always placing himself where he could see the door, because a man with his history had made enemies enough, and knew that some ambitious nobody might try to make a name by taking down Wild Bill Hickok. But the sureness was going out of him. The eyes that had once been the fastest and truest on the frontier were clouding over, and he must have felt, in his clearer moments, the ground shifting under an existence built entirely on being quicker than the next man. He was not old, not yet 40, but he was a relic already, a figure from a West that was closing down around him, reduced to trading on his fading legend across a card table for the price of a steak and a bed. Into that guttering twilight of his fame walked a woman who saw not the fading man, but the blazing myth, and loved the myth with everything she had. To grasp the scale of what dazzled her, it helps to recall just how large Hickok's legend loomed by then. He had been the subject of magazine articles and dime novels for years, written up as the deadliest pistol fighter alive, the lawman who had cleaned up the wildest of the Kansas cattle towns, the scout and the gambler and the gunman whose exploits, real and invented, were known to every boy in America. Some of it was true and much of it was not, and Hickok himself had a showman's instinct for tending his own myth, never quite confirming and never quite denying the wilder tales. He had already toured, briefly and unhappily, as a performer, standing on a stage in the East playing at being himself, so that the line between the real Wild Bill and the legendary one was, in his case too, hopelessly blurred long before he reached Deadwood. He was, in short, the most romantic figure the frontier had yet produced, a living storybook hero, and to a woman who lived half in the world of tales herself. Illiterate, but drenched in the oral legends of the West, he must have seemed less a man than a dream made flesh, riding beside her on the road. Wild Bill Hickok, in that last summer of his life, was a newlywed. Only months earlier, in March of 1876, in Cheyenne, he had married a woman named Agnes Lake, a celebrated circus proprietor and horsewoman, older than himself, and every bit as bold. A genuine star of the traveling ring who had run her own show across half the country. Theirs was by every surviving sign a real and tender love, years in the making. He had left her behind to seek his fortune in the hills, and he wrote to her from Deadwood as any devoted husband might, letters full of longing and plans for the home they would build together. In the very last of them, sent only a fortnight before the end, he wrote to her the sort of line that breaks your heart to read, knowing what came after. He told her simply that they would have a home yet, and then they would be so happy. That is the man Martha Jane rode into Deadwood beside, a fading legend, half blind, chasing one last strike, and thoroughly, hopelessly in love with somebody else. It is worth pausing on the woman he truly loved, because she is the shadow that falls across the whole of Calamity Jane's romance, and she deserves better than to be a footnote. Agnes Lake was no ordinary frontier wife. She was a genuine star, a celebrated equestrienne and tightrope walker and lion tamer who had run one of the great traveling circuses of the age, managing a whole company of performers and animals across the country, in an era when almost no woman ran anything at all. She was bold and capable and independent, a full match for Hickok in daring and in fame, and their marriage, for all that cynics later sneered at the difference in their ages, seems to have been a true meeting of two large and unconventional spirits. That is the rival, if rival is even the word, against whom Martha Jane's devotion was set. Not some soft and sheltered lady, but a woman every bit as remarkable as herself, whom Hickok had chosen, and married, and was writing home to with plans for their future, in the very weeks that Calamity Jane was losing her heart to him on the road to Deadwood. There is no contest in it, only a quiet and enormous sadness, two extraordinary women and one doomed man, and the wrong one lying beside him now on the hill. And she fell for him anyway. This is the great sad hinge of her whole story, and we have to handle it with care, because the truth is neither the romance the legend later sold nor a thing to be laughed at. What the honest record suggests is that Martha Jane, riding in that wagon train from Fort Laramie, met the most famous man in the West, a man as loud and outsized and full of tall tales as she was herself, and lost her heart to him with the sudden completeness of a person who has never had anywhere safe to put such feeling, whether they were friends, whether he tolerated her, whether they shared a bottle and a laugh on the road north, we cannot fully know. What almost every serious historian who has weighed the evidence has concluded is that whatever passed between them ran overwhelmingly one way. Wild Bill was newly and happily married and looking homeward. Calamity Jane, motherless since childhood, orphaned and hardened and starved of tenderness her whole life, fixed upon him the entire weight of a devotion she had never been able to spend on anyone, and she went on spending it in one form or another for the 27 years that were left to her. There is no shame in her in that, whatever the sniggering dime novels made of it later. There is only something achingly recognizable. Here was a woman the world had never once treated gently, who had learned to armor herself in noise and buckskin and whiskey, and who found in the most dazzling figure of her age a place to pour all the softness she could show no other way. That the devotion was not returned, that it may barely have been noticed, does not make it foolish. It makes it human and sad and true. Hold that picture of her steady, because everything that is about to happen to her and everything she is about to become turns on this one unanswered love. There is a particular kind of love that fixes on the unreachable, and hers may have been of that kind, and it is not the foolish thing that it is sometimes made to sound. A woman who has been hurt as often and as young as Martha Jane had learned, without ever deciding to, that the safest devotion is one that can never be tested, never be lost, because it was never truly possessed. To adore a legend, a dazzling and largely unattainable man, and then, when death has placed him forever beyond reach, to keep on adoring him across the empty years, is in its way a means of caring without the risk of the ordinary heartbreak she had known too much of already. He could not leave her, or disappoint her, or die on her a second time. He could only stay, fixed and perfect, at the still center of her turning life, the one constant in all her wandering. We may call it an obsession if we like, and perhaps it was. But it was also, seen kindly, the one love she ever found that could not be taken from her. And it is little wonder she held it so hard and so long. For underneath everything, beneath the swagger and the tall tales and the roomful of drinking companions, she was one of the loneliest figures the frontier ever produced. And the loneliness is the thread that runs through the whole of her from beginning to end. She had lost her mother as a child, and her father soon after lost the brothers and sisters she had struggled to keep, lost the one man she fixed her heart upon almost as soon as she found him, and never, in all her years, managed to build the ordinary web of family and belonging that holds most lives together. She was surrounded, much of the time, by people, and known to thousands, and famous across a continent, and none of it touched the essential solitude at her core. The drinking eased it a little, and the storytelling, and the crowded saloons, and the fierce devotion to a dead man's memory. But it was always there, the great cold hollow her whole restless life was spent trying and failing to fill. And it is the deepest reason, in the end, that her story moves us. Because loneliness is the one thing in her that needs no translation across the years, the one wound anyone alive can recognize as their own. Now, let us come down at last into the gulch itself, into Deadwood in the high summer of 1876, because there is nowhere quite like it in the whole story of the American West. Imagine a narrow, twisting canyon deep in the pine-dark hills, so tight in places that the crooked Main Street has barely room to squeeze between the slopes, and up those slopes the grey skeletons of dead trees standing where the fire and the axe had left them, the timber that gave the town its name. Down in the bottom, along the creek, a raw explosion of a settlement had thrown itself up in a matter of weeks. A mile of false-fronted saloons and gambling halls and stores and cribs and tents and hastily nailed cabins, mud underfoot, wood smoke in the air, and everywhere the ceaseless racket of a place being built and gambled and drunk all at once. It was rich beyond dreaming and lawless beyond belief, a town of some thousands with no legal right to exist, packed with miners and gamblers and outlaws and merchants, and the women who worked the halls, everyone there for the same yellow reason, and everyone half aware they were living on borrowed ground and borrowed time. Let the gulch fill in around you for a moment, because Deadwood in that summer was one of the strangest and most vivid places on the face of the earth. By day it was a churn of purposeful chaos, ore wagons and pack trains grinding through the mud of the single crooked street, the hammering of new building never ceasing, miners coming down from the diggings caked in clay, merchants crying their goods, the whole narrow canyon ringing with the noise of a fortune being torn out of the ground. And by night it did not sleep so much as change its character. The saloons and the gambling halls and the dance houses threw their lamplight out across the mud, and the music and the shouting and the click of chips rolled up the dark slopes, and the men who had spent the day grubbing in the diggings came down to spend it as fast as they could on whiskey and cards and company. It was loud and dangerous and alive in a way that drew exactly the sort of restless, hopeful, damaged soul that Martha Jane was, And for one bright season it was hers, a town with no rules to speak of, where a woman in buckskin who could drink and swear and ride was not an outrage but a local character, welcome at every fire. And she found her own place among the townspeople quickly enough, for Deadwood was full of the kind of folk who took her as she came. There was a well-known woman of the town, a leading madam of the Gulch, who liked Calamity Jane and gave her work from time to time, and remained something of a friend to her across the years, one of the many in that rough society who saw past the swagger to the good-natured, open-handed creature underneath. For all its violence and its greed, Deadwood was in its way a democratic place. A town of outsiders where a person's past was their own affair, and a person's worth was measured by how they behaved when it counted, and by that measure, Martha Jane did well enough. She was generous when she had anything to be generous with, quick to stand around or share a meal or sit up with the sick, and the town returned the affection in its rough fashion, taking her to itself as one of its own true originals, which, of all the towns in all the West, was exactly the thing she had spent her whole roaming life looking for. Into this roaring gulch rode Calamity Jane, and the town took to her at once, because a place like Deadwood knew one of its own when it saw her. When the wagon train came down the street that summer, the local paper, the Black Hills Pioneer, marked her arrival with a single wry line that tells you everything about how far the name had already travelled. Calamity Jane, it announced to its readers, has arrived. Not Martha Cannary, not a woman teamster newly come to camp. Calamity Jane, as though the town had been expecting her, as though her reputation were a fact of nature like the weather. She threw herself into the life of the place with her whole heart. By some accounts, she carried the mail that summer over one of the roughest stretches of trail in the hills, the long, dangerous run between Deadwood and the camp at Custer, 50 miles of country where a rider took her life in her hands. And she rode it, and the miners loved her for it. She drank in the saloons and swapped stories with the gamblers, and was for that one bright spell exactly where she had always most wanted to be, at the loud beating heart of things, somebody, in a town that took her as she was. Think for a moment of what that mail run actually asked of a rider, because it was no small thing. The trail between the camps wound for miles through steep, timbered, broken country, up over ridges and down into ravines, along stretches where a horse could go lame or a rider be thrown, and through territory where the danger was real and constant. To carry the post over it was to set out alone into that wild country, trusting your horse and your nerve and your knowledge of the ground, with no company but the wind in the pines and no help within call if anything went wrong. Most would not attempt it. She did, and by the accounts that survive, she did it well, riding through weather and hazard that would have turned back many a man, delivering the letters that were, in a camp cut off from everything, a precious thread back to the lives people had left behind. The miners, who knew exactly what such a ride cost, thought the more of her for it, and it is one of the deeds of her Deadwood summer that seems to rest on solid ground, a real and useful courage, freely spent. In the one season she was truly happy. It was, we should remember, a perilous paradise even at its brightest, for Deadwood in that first summer was as dangerous a place as existed on the continent. Sudden death was commonplace, from the gun and the knife and the sheer recklessness of the diggings, and the law such as it was could not keep pace with it. Fire was a constant terror in a town built entirely of raw pine and packed tight in a narrow gulch, and disease brewed in the filth and crowding, and would, before long, break out in the epidemic that showed the town what Calamity Jane was truly made of. Preachers came to the gulch and were struck down, honest men and rogues alike ended in the hillside cemetery, and everyone lived cheek by jowl with the knowledge that their boom town was a fragile and violent thing that might be taken from them by fire or claim jumper or failing luck at any hour. Into all of that Martha Jane fit as snugly as into a glove, for she had been living close to danger and death her whole life, and a town where every day might be your last suited a woman who had long since stopped expecting the world to be gentle. And what a mingling of the world's peoples that camp was, for the gold drew them from everywhere. Along the crooked street of the gulch, you might hear a dozen tongues in a single afternoon, for the rush had pulled in men from every corner of the continent and far beyond it, farmers from the worn-out east, and veterans of both grey and blue, immigrants fresh from Europe with the sea barely off them, and a sizable community of Chinese, who kept their own quarter of the town with its laundries and eating houses and shops of unfamiliar goods. It was a raw, rough, unequal, and often unkind mingling, for the age carried all its cruelties into the gulch along with its hopes. But it was a coming together nonetheless, a whole small world thrown into a narrow canyon by the lure of the same yellow metal, and Martha Jane moved through all of it as easily as she moved through everything, at home among the uprooted and the striving, because she was one of them herself, a piece of the great human tide that the gold had washed into the hills. Those months were, in all likelihood, the happiest stretch of her whole grown existence, and it is worth dwelling on before the shadow falls, because she had so few such stretches. She was known, she was liked, she was where she wanted to be. She ran errands and carried messages, and by the accounts that survive, took her turn carrying the mail over the wild trail between Deadwood and the outlying camps. A hard and hazardous ride through steep timbered country that most would not attempt, and she made it again and again, and the miners thought the world of her for it. She drank with them and told them her stories, each one taller than the last, and they bought the rounds and roared at the tales and asked for more. She had spent her whole existence on the outside of things, orphaned and poor and odd, forever the one who did not fit, and here, at last, in the loudest and roughest and least respectable town in the West, she fit perfectly and belonged and was loved after a fashion. And for a few short weeks the long ache in her went quiet. And then, on an August afternoon, the whole shape of her life changed in the space of a single pistol shot, in a saloon she was not even standing in. Wild Bill Hickok had a rule, learned in a lifetime of watching doors, that he never sat with his back to a room. On this one afternoon, in a crowded Deadwood saloon, the only open seat at the poker table, put his back to the entrance, and against his own long habit, against every instinct that had kept him breathing, he took it. A drifter named Jack McCall, who had lost badly to Hickok the day before and been offered, with rough kindness, the money for his breakfast, walked in through that unguarded door, stepped up behind the most famous gunfighter in America, and shot him once in the back of the head. Wild Bill died where he sat, the cards still in his hand. The pair of aces and the pair of eights he was holding would pass into American folklore forever after as the dead man's hand. It was the 2nd of August, 1876. He had been in Deadwood a matter of weeks, and married to Agnes for a matter of months, and he was not yet 40. The news went through Deadwood like a cold wind. Wild Bill Hickok, the most famous man ever to set foot in the gulch, shot dead at a card table in the middle of the afternoon, was a shock even to a town well used to sudden death, and the place turned out in numbers to bury him. His friend Charlie Utter took charge of the arrangements and laid him to rest in the hillside ground above the town, and on the wooden marker they set over him, in the rough poetry of the frontier, they carved a farewell from one pard to another, a promise that the two of them would meet again in the happy hunting ground and part no more. He was buried, in other words, with real grief and real ceremony, mourned as a friend and a legend both. And somewhere in that crowd, or near it, was the woman who would spend the next 27 years insisting she had loved him best of all, watching the man on whom she had fixed her whole heart lowered into the earth of a town they had entered together only weeks before. What that loss did to her privately in the days and weeks after, we can only guess at, for she was not a woman who spoke of her deepest hurts, except by turning them into stories. But it is not hard to feel the shape of it. The one bright thing in her sky had been struck down almost the moment it appeared, senselessly, at a card table, by a coward with a grudge, and the town she had ridden into so full of hope that summer became, overnight, the place where they buried Wild Bill. She had known him a matter of weeks. It should not, by any ordinary measure, have marked her so deeply, and yet it marked her for the whole of the rest of her days, which tells you less about the man than about the vast, unspent tenderness she had been carrying all her life, looking for somewhere to put it, and about how completely she had emptied that whole store into him. When he died, some part of her closed over the loss and never opened again, and she carried him, from that August afternoon, like a stone she could neither drop nor stop holding. In the long years afterward, she kept his memory the way the devout keep a relic, tending it, returning to it, letting it grow more precious with time. She spoke of him constantly to anyone who would listen, weaving herself ever more tightly into his story with each telling, until, in her own account at least, they were the great lovers of the frontier. She is said to have visited the grave on the hillside above Deadwood when she could, standing among the pines beside the marker of the man she had chosen to love, and it is not hard to imagine what those visits meant to her. A rare, quiet communion with the one fixed point in her restless days. Whether he would have wished it, whether he would even have known her name for certain, is beside the point by then. The Wild Bill she loved was, in the end, largely her own creation, a figure she had built out of a few real weeks and a great deal of longing, and she was faithful to that creation with a constancy she showed nothing and no one else on earth, right up until the day she asked to be buried at his side. What Calamity Jane did in that moment, and in the days and years that followed, is where the woman and the legend she was building finally become impossible to pull apart. In the story she would tell for the rest of her life, and that the dime novels seized upon with glee, she was Hickok's own true love, and at the news of his killing she flew into a towering grief and vengeance. In some tellings she cradled his head as he lay dying. In others she snatched up a meat cleaver and went hunting his murderer through the streets of Deadwood, driving McCall to ground with the fury of a wronged woman. It is magnificent, and it is almost certainly untrue, and the truth is quieter, and in its way sadder. There is no good evidence that Jane took any revenge at all. She was in Deadwood when it happened, that much is real, but the cleaver and the chase and the deathbed embrace belong to the legend she spun afterward, the tale in which she got to be the great love of the great man, the story that made her matter, the story she could not write down but could always, always tell. The killing did something else besides breaking her heart, though she can hardly have seen it at the time. It made Deadwood immortal. The murder of the most famous gunfighter in America, shot in the back at a card table in a lawless gold camp, was exactly the sort of vivid, terrible, romantic event that the myth-making machinery of the age fed upon, and it fixed the little gulch forever in the national imagination, as the very type and capital of the Wild West. And because Calamity Jane had ridden in beside the murdered man, and because she was there when it happened, and because she told and retold the account of it for the rest of her days, she wove herself permanently into the most famous killing of the frontier. Wild Bill's death became, in the strange economy of legend, a part of her own fame, the dark jewel at the center of the tale she carried from town to town. She had lost the man, but the loss, retold, became the thing that kept her a somebody to the end. The manner of Hickok's death passed so completely into legend that it is worth separating, for a moment, the little we truly know from the great deal we have imagined. The cards he was said to be holding, the 2 black aces and the 2 black eights, became known ever after as the dead man's hand, and gamblers speak of it with a shiver to this day, though whether those were truly the cards on the table when he fell, no one can now be certain. The motive of the man who killed him is nearly as murky. At his first illegal trial, McCall claimed a brother's death for his excuse, and there seems to have been no brother at all, and other accounts have it that he was simply a sore loser, humiliated at the tables, nursing a grudge, perhaps put up to it by others who wanted Wild Bill gone. The plain, ugly heart of it is the only thing quite certain. A famous man shot from behind by a nobody in a lawless town over nothing that will ever be fully known, and out of that squalid, meaningless killing the age spun one of its most enduring romances, with Calamity Jane, in her own telling, at the very center of it. The real reckoning came not from her, but from the slow, stumbling hand of frontier law. Jack McCall was hauled before a hastily assembled miners' court in Deadwood, where he claimed that Hickok had years before killed his brother, and that he had only taken his revenge, and the improvised jury, whether from sympathy or bribery or the simple lawlessness of a town that had no business holding trials at all, set him free. He made the mistake of bragging about it afterward. Because Deadwood sat on treaty land where the miners' court had no legal standing, the acquittal was worth nothing, and when McCall drifted into the Wyoming country boasting of his deed, the federal marshals took him up in earnest. He was tried again, properly this time, in the territorial court at Yankton, and this second jury saw him plain, and found him guilty. And in the spring of 1877, Jack McCall was hanged for the murder of Wild Bill Hickok. Hickok himself was buried at his friend Charlie Utter's camp above the town, under a wooden marker and a friend's farewell, in the hillside cemetery that would, 27 years on, receive one more famous frontier body and set the seal on the strangest love story the West ever half invented. The pursuit of McCall to a lawful reckoning is a small drama worth following because it shows the frontier haltingly growing up. His first acquittal, before that improvised miners' court, was a farce and a scandal, the kind of rough non-justice a lawless camp handed out, and had he only kept his mouth shut, he might have gone free forever. But he could not resist boasting of the killing, and in doing so he wandered into the reach of the real law, the federal courts of the territory, which held that a trial on the illegal soil of Deadwood had no standing at all, and that McCall could therefore be tried afresh without any double jeopardy. So they took him to Yankton, the territorial capital, and gave him a proper trial with a proper jury, and this time the verdict went the other way, and this time it stuck. He was hanged in the spring, protesting to the last, and the man who had shot the most famous gunfighter in America in the back of the head went to a criminal's grave, while his victim passed into immortality. It was not the wild revenge of Calamity Jane's legend. It was something slower and colder, and, in the end, more just, the law catching up at last, with the lawless. If the summer of Wild Bill's death was the moment the legend fixed its shape, what came next was the moment the true worth of the woman showed itself, and it happened, as such things so often did, in the middle of horror. Not long after Hickok was buried, a sickness came to Deadwood that put the fear of God into a town that feared very little. Smallpox broke out in the crowded, filthy gulch, and it spread through the tents and cribs and cabins the way fire spreads through dry timber, and it was the most dreaded word on the whole frontier, a disfiguring, agonizing, frequently fatal disease with no cure, and in a lawless mining camp, almost no one willing to go near the afflicted. The sick were carried off to a rough log pest house set apart from the town, a place people avoided the way they would avoid a grave, and there, in ordinary circumstances, the worst cases were left more or less to die alone, rather than risk the healthy. Calamity Jane walked straight into it. While respectable Deadwood bolted its doors and prayed, the hard-drinking, foul-mouthed camp follower whom that same respectable town looked down upon went out to the pest house and nursed the dying. She had no training worth the name, and no protection at all beyond her own reckless courage, and she stayed among the sick day after day, washing them and feeding them, and cooling their fevers, and sitting with the ones past saving, so that they would not have to go out of the world alone. She did it for strangers. She did it for no pay, and no thanks, and no reward of any kind except the thing itself. There was a doctor in Deadwood, an old frontier physician who worked those wards alongside her, and long afterward he tried to describe what he had witnessed, and what he said has outlasted every tall tale she ever told about herself, because it is plainly, unmistakably real. She would swear at her patients something terrible, he remembered, cursing up a storm over the sickbeds. But it was, he said, a tender kind of cursing, a tender kind of cursing. In 4 words, an old country doctor caught the whole truth of her that the dime novels never found. Let yourself understand gently what she actually walked into, because it puts the measure of her courage beyond any doubt. Smallpox was among the most dreaded afflictions of the age, a disease that killed a great share of those. It struck and left many of the survivors scarred, and it was hideously contagious, so that to nurse its victims was to gamble your own life on every visit. There was no vaccine to be had in a raw mining camp, and no real treatment beyond keeping the sick clean and cool and comforted, and waiting to see who would live. The pest house where they were carried was a place of dread, set apart, shunned, and inside it the hours were long and grim, the fevers high, the suffering plain, the danger constant. And into that place again and again walked Calamity Jane, of her own free will, and stayed, doing the humblest and most frightening work there was, easing the passage of strangers who could do nothing for her in return. She who had so little, and owed the world so little, gave it this. It is the single finest thing we know for certain that she ever did, and no dime novel ever had to invent a word of it. That is the woman, the legend buried under the buckskin and the gunplay, and once you have seen her at the pest house, you can never quite unsee her. All the noise and swagger, all the whiskey and the profanity, and the men's clothes, were the outer weather of a person whose deepest instinct, again and again across her whole life, was to run towards suffering that everyone else was running away from. She had been mothering since she was a motherless girl of 13 on a westward road, and she never stopped, only the children changed. Now they were pock-stricken miners in a log hut on the edge of a gold camp, and she tended them exactly as she had tended her orphaned brothers and sisters, with rough hands and terrible language, and a devotion that asked for nothing back. The town that mocked her by day owed her its dead nursed and its living pulled through, and some of Deadwood knew it, and remembered. And the pest house was only the most dramatic instance of a pattern that ran through the whole of her existence. Wherever she went, across all the drifting years, the same reports followed her, of Calamity Jane giving away her last dollar to someone worse off, of Calamity Jane sitting up all night with a sick miner or a fevered child, of Calamity Jane taking in a stray, feeding a drunk, standing up for the friendless. She had almost nothing herself for most of her life, and what she had she gave with an open hand, so that the same woman who could not keep herself in funds for a week was forever impoverishing herself further to help someone in a worse plight. It was not calculated charity, and it won her no lasting reward. The epidemic she nursed the town through was no small visitation either, and the toll of it lingered long in Deadwood's memory. Smallpox in a crowded, filthy, ill-provisioned mining camp could cut through the population like a scythe, and a good many of those carried up to the pest house never came down again, and were buried on the hillside with the rest of the gulch's dead. That she went in among them and stayed, night after night, when doctors were few, and helpers fewer, and the healthy kept their distance in terror, was a thing the survivors did not forget. Years later, when the drink and the drifting had reduced her to a shabby and diminished figure, there were still men in that country who would not hear a word against her, because they or theirs had been tended by her rough hands in the worst days of the sickness, and owed her, quite literally, their lives. Whatever else the record holds against her, and it holds a good deal, it also holds this, freely given and never repaid, and it weighs more than all the rest. The doctor who worked those pest wards beside her left the fullest picture of her at her finest, and it is worth lingering on, because it is a rare thing, a clear-eyed eyewitness account of the real woman doing real good. He did not sentimentalize her. He described her exactly as she was, rough and profane and hard, swearing a blue streak over the beds of the dying, even as she tended them with her own hands. That was the paradox he could not get over and could not forget. The terrible language and the tender care running together in the same person at the same moment, the curses and the kindness inseparable. It was not the gentle, soft-spoken angel of the sick room that the age liked to imagine. It was something rarer and more human, a hard soul doing the hardest and kindest work there was in the only voice she had, and swearing at death itself as she wrestled the sick back from it, or eased them through. He remembered it all his life, and because he wrote it down, we have, in his few plain words, one of the truest portraits of her that survives, worth more than a library of dime novels. It was simply the way she was made, a generosity so instinctive that it operated even against her own plain interest. And it is one of the reasons that the people who actually knew her, as opposed to the ones who only read about her, so often remembered her with a helpless, exasperated love. Around this bedrock of real and quiet goodness, the legend went on growing like ivy, and it is worth spending a little while among the tales themselves, because the making of Calamity Jane the myth is as much a part of her story as anything she actually did. The most famous of the frontier exploits she claimed came from around this period. There was, she said, the day she saved a stagecoach. The coach was running the wild road between Cheyenne and Deadwood, so the story went, when it was set upon and its driver struck down, and the horses bolted in terror with the passengers helpless inside. Calamity Jane, riding nearby, gave chase, drew alongside the runaway team at the gallop, sprang across, gathered the reins, and brought the whole careering coach safely down into Deadwood, 6 passengers and a wounded driver delivered alive by her nerve and her horsemanship. It is a wonderful piece of frontier theatre, and versions of it filled the dime novels for decades. Whether it happened as she told it, or happened at all, no one can now say for certain, but it lived because it fit her. Because a woman who really had done the hard riding and the real rescuing of her early life was exactly the sort of woman such a tale would attach itself to. And that is the crucial thing to understand about the legend of Calamity Jane. It grew so wildly because the ground was fertile. She really could ride and shoot with the best of the men. She really had nursed the dying and driven the teams and crossed the dangerous country. So when the writers came, and they came in numbers, hungry for colourful characters to sell to an Eastern public greedy for the romance of a West that was already vanishing, they found in her a figure they could pour any amount of invention into. And the invention would stick, because the outline was true even when the details were fancy. By the end of the 1870s, she was appearing as a heroine in cheap novels she could not read, performing daring deeds she had never done, in a version of her own life that was slipping further from her grasp with every printing. She had made herself somebody by seizing a nickname. Now the somebody she had made was taking on a life of its own, and it would both feed her and devour her for the rest of her days. By now there were two Calamity Janes, and the gap between them was widening all the time. There was the real one, aging and roughening and drifting through the frontier towns, and there was the other one, the paper heroine, forever young and dashing and brave, riding through the pages of the cheap Eastern novels, performing feats of daring the living woman had never dreamt of. The printed Calamity rescued wagon trains and outshot desperados, and moved through a West of pure adventure that had never quite existed. The living one grew tired and poor and often unwell, and could not read a single word of the deeds attributed to her, and yet had increasingly to compete with her own bright shadow, to measure up, when she appeared before the curious, to a fantasy no flesh and blood woman could match. It is a peculiarly modern kind of unhappiness, to be outshone by the image of yourself, and Calamity Jane may have been among the first ordinary people ever to suffer it, a real human being slowly eclipsed by the legend that bore her name. The cheap novels that did the eclipsing spun their own whole mythical West, and Calamity Jane was folded into it as a stock heroine, most often paired with a dashing fictional outlaw hero of the sort those stories loved, riding at his side through endless invented adventures. The reading public back east devoured it. This thrilling, sanitized, wholly imaginary frontier of noble desperados and daring frontier maidens, and the living people whose names were borrowed for it, the actual Hickocks and the actual Janes, became characters in a fantasy they had no hand in shaping. In the pages she was young and beautiful and free, forever galloping to the rescue, forever loved. In life she was aging and poor and often ill, and the contrast, had she been able to read it, might have broken her heart, or made her laugh, or both. As it was, she carried her printed self about with her, and sold it for pennies, and let the paper heroine do the work of keeping the real woman fed, the two of them travelling together, the legend and the woman it was slowly swallowing, to the very end of the road. And yet, in the telling, she must have been magnificent, for it was the one art she truly had. Picture her holding forth in some lamplit saloon, a bottle at her elbow and a ring of listeners drawn in close, spinning out the tales of her adventuring in that rough, profane, vivid frontier idiom, watching the faces around her light up, timing the turns, savouring the effect. She could not write a word, but she was a storyteller to the bone, a keeper and embellisher of the oral legends that were the real literature of the frontier, and her own life was her greatest material. Each telling polished the tales a little brighter, added a detail, sharpened a line, until the deeds she claimed had a life and a shine all their own, quite apart from whatever had truly happened. It was how she made her way, in the end, this gift of the spoken tale, trading stories for drinks and company, and a kind of immortality. The tragedy was only that the words, once spoken, blew away like smoke, and the versions that lasted were the ones other hands wrote down, in colder ink, for colder reasons. Because here is the sorrow underneath the swagger. The legend paid in fame, and fame was the one currency Calamity Jane had, but it did not pay in the things a person actually needs, and the flesh and blood woman, the one who could not read her own press, went on living hand to mouth in the gap between the myth and the truth. After Deadwood, The trail of her days scatters and grows faint, and the years that follow are a long, wandering downward drift across the northern plains. She left the gulch and roamed, as she had always roamed, through the raw towns of Dakota and Wyoming and Montana, taking the old work where she could get it, driving teams, cooking, tending bar, doing whatever the day offered, and drinking, more and more, with a thirst that was slowly becoming the master of her rather than the servant. The gulch she loved did not last in the form she knew it, for boom towns rarely do. Within a few years of that first roaring summer, fire swept through Deadwood, as fire sooner or later swept through nearly every tinder-dry mining camp in the West, and much of the raw pine town she had ridden into went up in a night and had to be built over again. Floods followed, and the easy surface gold played out, and the diggings passed from the lone prospector with his pan to the great companies with their capital and their machinery, and the wild, lawless, leveling camp of the rush settled by degrees into an ordinary incorporated town with banks and ordinances and a railroad of its own. The Deadwood of her one great summer, the mud and the lamplight and the roar of the strike, existed in its full wild form for only a handful of years before it began to tame and change. She outlived that version of it, as she outlived so much else, and when she came back to those hills at the last it was to a quieter and more settled place, still home to her, but no longer the wide-open gulch, where she had once, for one bright season, truly belonged. The years that followed have the quality of a slow fade, and they are hard to follow closely because she herself grew harder to follow, drifting through the towns of the northern plains as the frontier she had known began to close and settle and forget her. She would turn up in one place, a mining camp, a railroad town, a fort, work for a while and drink for a while, and stir up the usual mixture of affection and exasperation, and then move on, or be moved on, to the next. The seasons turned over her, the bitter plains winters and the brief green springs, and she grew older and rougher and more worn. And the drinking, which had begun as the common recourse of a hard and lonely road, tightened its grip season by season until it was less a habit than a master. There were spells of the old competence, stretches of honest work and real kindness, and there were worse spells, times when she was destitute and sick, and leaning on the charity of towns that half remembered her fame. Through all of it she carried her legend about with her like a pack. She could neither set down nor cash in, famous and poor in the same breath, a name everyone knew fastened to a woman nobody quite knew what to do with. The towns she passed through collected stories about her, the way she collected them about herself, and some of them have the ring of the real thing. There is one from a saloon up in the Dakota country, in which a party of newcomers took it into their heads to poke fun at the notorious frontierswoman drinking among them, not knowing quite who they were dealing with, Calamity Jane. So the tale runs, smiled, drew a pair of pistols, and invited the tenderfeet to dance. And dance they did, with considerable vigour, until she was satisfied. Whether it happened just so hardly matters. What matters is that it was the kind of thing people believed of her, and believed readily, because it fit the woman they knew, formidable and quick-tempered and not to be mocked, and yet, in the manner of the telling, more comic than cruel. She had become, in her own lifetime and her own person, a walking piece of the Wild West, and the towns she drifted through half feared her and half delighted in her, and either way, never forgot that she had passed. It is worth remembering, and what all these towns she blew through actually lived on, the hard and hopeful labour at the bottom of it all. The miners she drank with and nursed and cadged from spent their days in brutal work, crouched in the icy creeks swirling gravel in a pan, or digging and timbering the shafts that followed the gold down into the dark, or working the great sluices that tore the pay dirt out of the hillsides. For every man who struck it rich, and a few did, spectacularly, there were 100 who broke their health and their hearts and came up with nothing, and drifted on to the next rumour of colour in the next gulch over. It was a lottery dressed up as an industry, and the towns it built were as impermanent as the luck that made them, roaring one year and half empty the next when the diggings played out. Lie back for a moment, into the feel of a night in that gulch at the height of the rush, because it is the kind of scene her whole legend rests upon. The dark comes down early between the steep pine slopes, and the narrow town fills with lamplight, spilling yellow from 100 windows out across the churned mud of the street. There is the smell of wood smoke and frying meat, and the raw resin of new-cut timber, and under it the deeper reek of a crowded camp, and threading through it all the sounds, the tinny piano in one saloon and the fiddle in another, the burst of laughter, the click and rattle of the gambling tables, the endless low river of men's voices talking of gold. Somewhere a dog barks, somewhere a shot is fired into the air, and above the whole roaring lamplit, restless bowl of the town, the great cold mountain stars come out, indifferent and clear, wheeling slowly over a place that will be gone in a generation. This was the world she loved best, the loud, warm human heart of a boom town at night, and if she was ever truly happy anywhere, it was here. And then, toward morning, even that roaring town grew quiet at last. In the grey hour before dawn, the music died, and the lamps guttered out one by one, and a thin, cold mist gathered along the creek at the bottom of the gulch, and for a while the feverish settlement lay still and hushed under the paling sky. The last drinkers stumbled home. The stamp of the diggings had not yet started up. Somewhere a rooster crowed, and the smoke of the first breakfast fires rose straight up into the windless air, and the great dark pines on the ridges stood black against the coming light. It is worth holding that dawn hush in mind, because it was the other face of the town she loved, the brief daily peace that came when the long night finally spent itself. She knew that hour well, no doubt, having so often been among the last awake in it, and perhaps in that grey stillness, with the whole gulch asleep around her, even she found something like rest. Martha Jane lived her days among these gamblers with picks, and shared their boom and bust existence, flush and generous when times were good, and destitute when they were not, and never, any more than they did, quite managing to hold on to whatever the good times brought. She was never, in these drifting years, entirely alone, and she was never quite settled either. There were men, a rancher up in the Wyoming country, a fellow or two whose names the newspapers recorded with a sneer, a string of attachments that flared and failed. She seems to have been forever reaching for the ordinary domestic happiness that the whole shape of her days conspired to deny her, the home and the hearth and the steady man, and forever finding that it slipped away, undone by poverty or drink or her own restless, ungovernable nature, or simply by the plain hard fact that a woman famous for being a calamity was not what most men of the age were looking to marry. Through all of it, in the strange geography of her heart, the figure of Wild Bill remained fixed and unreachable, a dead man she had known for a matter of weeks, elevated across the lonely years into the great lost love of her life, the standard against which every living man was measured and found wanting. The men who did come and go through those years make a sorry little procession, and the records mostly note them with a sneer. There was a rancher up in the Wyoming country she was linked with for a time. There was another fellow the newspapers dismissed as a thorough good-for-nothing, one of the worthless sort who drift through hard towns leaving trouble behind them. None of it lasted, and none of it, so far as we can tell, gave her much of what she was truly after, which was not passion or excitement, of which her life had already furnished more than enough, but simply steadiness. A hand to hold and a roof to share, and someone who would still be there in the morning. That ordinary thing, which the whole world seemed to manage, and she never could, stayed just out of her reach, and each failed attachment left her a little more alone and a little more convinced that the only man who could ever have made her happy was the one lying under the pines above. Deadwood, safely dead, and therefore safely perfect. The love she could keep forever precisely because she had never really had it. And the country itself, the whole wild frontier that had made her and given her the only life she was fit for, was disappearing out from under her as she aged. The great buffalo herds that had darkened the plains in her girlhood were slaughtered nearly to nothing within a few short years. The open range was fenced with the new barbed wire and parceled into farms and ranches. The railroads spread their iron web across the map. The telegraph followed. The towns grew churches and courthouses and respectability, and the wide, lawless, dangerous, open West that a woman in buckskin could disappear into simply ceased to exist. Calamity Jane outlived her own world. She had been the perfect creature of a particular wild moment, and the moment passed, and left her stranded in a tamer age that had no use for her skills and no patience for her ways. A living relic of a frontier that survived now mostly in the very dime novels that had made her famous. There is no lonelier thing than to outlast the world you were made for, and she did it for 20 years and more. The hardest stretches of those late years do not bear too much dwelling on, but honesty asks that we not look wholly away from them either. There were winters when she was destitute, sick, and alone, thrown on the grudging charity of towns that half remembered her fame and wholly saw her decline. A shabby, aging, hard-drinking woman with nowhere to be. The body that had once ridden all day and slept on the ground grew swollen and slow and ill-used. The famous nerve dimmed into something more like recklessness, the storytelling into something closer to begging, and the drink, which had begun as comfort and become a habit and then a need, settled at last into the plain fact that governed her days. It is a common enough end for the hard-living and the unlucky, and there is no use dressing it up. But even here, in the worst of it, the old flashes came. The sudden generosity, the fierce kindness to some soul worse off than herself, the unbroken instinct to mother and to give, so that even the ruined creature was, to the last, unmistakably herself. And yet, in the middle of this wandering, something happened that shows how deep the wish for an ordinary settled home ran in her, and that is where we turn now, to the gentlest and most human chapter of her later years. Somewhere in the 1880s, Calamity Jane became, by most accounts, a wife and a mother. The records are tangled, as everything about her is tangled, but the thread of it is this. She took up with, and in time married, a man named Burke, Clinton Burke, called Charlie, a hack driver, an ordinary working man of the frontier towns. And she had a child, a daughter. For a woman who had spent her whole existence mothering other people's children and burying her own tenderness under armor, the arrival of a daughter of her own must have stirred a deep, buried longing to do it right this time, to give a child the safe and settled beginning that she had been robbed of on a westward road when she was scarcely more than a child. Of the marriage that gave her the daughter, we know less than we would like, but its shape is sadly familiar. The man was named Burke, a plain working fellow of the frontier towns, and for a while, in the 1880s, Martha Jane tried on the life of a settled wife with him, the settled domestic existence she had reached, for so often and grasped so rarely. It did not hold, any more than the others had. Whether it foundered on the drink, or on her restlessness, or on the plain impossibility of a woman like her ever fitting the small, tame shape of a housewife, the union came apart in time, as everything in her life eventually came apart, and left her once more essentially alone, save for the one bond that mattered more to her than any husband ever had. The daughter was the true fruit of those years, the one lasting thing, and it was to the daughter, not the marriage, that Martha Jane gave whatever steadiness and hope she had left in her, pouring into the child's future the whole of the tenderness she had never found a lasting home for anywhere else. For a little while, the wandering legend tried to become a settled mother, and you can feel, across the gap of a century and a half, how badly she wanted it to work. She spoke of her daughter with fierce pride and fiercer hope. She wanted the girl to have everything she had never had, above all an education, the reading and writing that had been closed to her own, and that she believed, rightly, was the door to a better one. And so she arranged for her daughter to be schooled properly, placed in the care of a convent school, where the sisters could give the child the letters, and the gentleness her mother could not. And she took on the hardest task she ever attempted, harder than any stagecoach or pest house, the task of earning and keeping and providing, steadily, soberly, for the future of the one person in the world who was entirely her own. Try to sit with how much that undertaking must have cost her, and how much it must have meant. Here was a person who had never once in her existence known security, who could not read a word, who had buried her parents beside two roads, and mothered a family of orphans before she was grown, and spent 30 years on the move with a bottle for company, now bending herself, late and against every odd, to the patient, unglamorous, sober business of providing for a child's future. She wanted her daughter to have the thing she had most sorely lacked, an education, a set of skills, a way to stand in the world that did not depend on charity or a strong back, or the selling of a legend. She placed the girl with the sisters at a convent school, where she would be taught her letters and her manners and given the orderly, gentle upbringing that Martha Jane herself had lost on a westward trail. And to keep her there, to pay for it, the wildest woman in the West set out to be for once steady and dependable and good, and reached, one last time, for the ordinary decent future that had slipped from her grasp at every turn. What became of that hope is the saddest thing in the whole story, and it is where we turn now. There is a night in the closing act of her story that holds the whole of her in it, the striving and the failing both, and it is worth sitting inside for a while, because it tells you more than any gunfight ever could. Picture a theatre in Deadwood, some years on, the old gulch grown into a more settled town now, boardwalks where there had been mud, glass in the windows, a hall got up with lamps and a little stage. The town has come out in numbers on this particular evening, and it has come out for her. Word has gone round that Calamity Jane, their own Calamity, the woman who nursed the pox-sick and carried the mail and rode in beside Wild Bill, is trying to raise money to keep her daughter in the convent school, to give the girl the schooling and the future her mother never had. And Deadwood, which has always had a rough, soft spot for her, has answered. The lamps are lit, the seats are full, and the money is being given, coin after coin, a genuinely large sum by the standards of a mining town, gathered up out of affection for a woman the respectable world had spent 20 years looking down its nose at. Let the room settle around you as it must have settled around her that night. The Deadwood of the 1890s was not the raw gulch she had ridden into 20 years before. The dead timber had long since been cleared. The mud had given way to boardwalks and brick. The worst of the lawlessness had been tamed into something like a real town, with churches and schools and respectable families who had made their money and meant to keep it. And in a lamplit hall in that grown-up place, the people who had come out were, many of them, the very sort who by daylight might cross the street to avoid her, turned out now in their good clothes to give what they could for the schooling of her daughter. There is a particular tenderness in that, the hard old town honouring its most disreputable daughter for the sake of the one soft hope she had left. Every coin dropped into that collection was a small verdict on a life, a quiet acknowledgement from a whole community that whatever Calamity Jane had been, drunkard and brawler and scandal, she had also been the one who nursed their sick and rode their mail, and stood by the beaten and the dying, and that the account, on balance, came down in her favour. Imagine how that evening must have felt to her, standing in the light of it. For once in her hard existence, the noise around her was warm, and it was for her, and it carried no mockery in it. For once the legend was paying out in the one thing she truly wanted. Not fame for its own sake, but the means to do right by her child, to buy her daughter out of the poverty and ignorance that had trapped her own beginnings. You can almost see her that night, weathered and proud and briefly, dangerously happy, holding in her hands the price of the one thing she had never managed to secure, a settled and gentle future for someone she loved. It should have been the redemption of the whole story. The wild woman comes good, the money is raised, the daughter is saved. The hard road bends at last toward mercy, and then the oldest enemy of her life reached up and took it from her, as it had taken so much else, quietly and without drama, in the way that the deepest tragedies usually arrive. The same night, or near enough, with the takings warm in her pocket and the affection of the town still ringing in her ears, Calamity Jane went out into Deadwood and she drank. She drank the way she had learned to drink across 30 hard years, to fill the great cold hollow that no amount of fame or affection had ever managed to warm, and by the accounts that survived she drank and spent and lost a great part of the very money that the town had given for her daughter's future. It is the single most heartbreaking fact in her whole heartbreaking story, more painful by far than any wound or grief, because it was not done to her by the frontier or by cruel men or by hard luck. It came from inside her, from the sickness she carried and could not put down, and she seems to have understood that, and to have been unable to stop it, even so. We must be careful and gentle with this, because it is the kind of thing a shallow telling turns into a joke, and a fair telling treats as the tragedy it was. Calamity Jane was not a fool or a monster. She was a woman with a disease that the age had no name for and no help to offer, a woman who had been self-medicating an unbearable loneliness with whiskey since she was barely grown, and who knew, in her clearer hours, exactly what it was costing her and those she loved. The proof that she knew is in the very effort of that benefit night, in the reaching for her daughter's future, in the desperate wish to be better than her thirst would let her be. The tragedy is not that she did not care, it is that she cared enormously, and cared, and cared, and the illness took the money anyway. Anyone who has loved someone caught in that particular trap will recognize the shape of it at once, the good intention and the good heart, and the thing that undoes them both, and will find it very hard indeed to laugh. What became of the daughter in the end is like so much else in this story, uncertain, and the uncertainty is its own quiet grief. The child passes through the record in glimpses, placed here, mentioned there, and then, as the mother's own days slid down toward their close, largely lost to view, growing up and away into a private life that history did not trouble to follow, we do not truly know whether the schooling took, whether the gentler future Martha Jane worked and drank and failed to secure was ever really won, whether mother and daughter found any lasting peace with one another before the end. One hopes so. One hopes that somewhere the girl grew up safe and lettered and settled, carrying in her the better part of her impossible mother, the courage and the open heart without the wreck of the drink. But the record does not say, and so the daughter remains, like the brothers and sisters before her, one more of the souls Martha Jane loved and could not keep, slipping quietly out of the tale as so many she had loved had slipped before. After that, the road runs mostly downhill, and the world she had helped to make began, in its careless way, to sell her back to herself. But the legend of Calamity Jane had grown into a genuine commodity now, a thing with cash value, and in the 1890s the woman herself, aging and ailing, and always short of money, was drawn into the strange business of performing her own myth for pay. She had a small life story taken down from her dictation, a sensational little booklet full of the tall tales she had polished over the decades, the soldiering and the scouting and the stagecoach, and the love of Wild Bill, and she carried bundles of these booklets about with her and sold them to the curious for a few pennies each, hawking the printed legend of herself hand to hand because she could not read a word of it. And she went on the stage, dime museums and travelling Wild West shows, hungry for authentic frontier flavour, took her on as a living relic, the real Calamity Jane in the buckskin flesh, and billed her to the gawping public as the famous woman scout, the heroine of 1,000 adventures, the comrade of Buffalo Bill and Wild Bill Hickok. There is a strange, sad modernity to what became of her in those years, a foretaste of a kind of fame the coming century would perfect. She had become, in effect, a brand, a piece of property that other hands could package and sell, and the raw material of it was her own embroidered past, offered up to strangers who paid their coins to see the notorious original breathing in front of them. It was a curious sort of poverty to be renowned and destitute at once, to own a name that put money in everyone's pocket but her own. The person who had actually lived the wild frontier now scraped her thin living by impersonating the myth of it, standing in engagement after engagement for a younger and braver and wholly imaginary version of herself, and the gap between the two only widened as the true one aged and failed. There is no crueler trick that renown can play than that, to keep a soul alive merely as the shadow of a self she had never quite been, and it played it on her without mercy to the very end. Try to feel the strangeness and the sadness of those show years. Here was someone who had genuinely lived the frontier, really driven the teams and nursed the dying and buried her own people along the westward roads, now dressed up in a costume version of her own past and paraded before city audiences who had never smelled a mule or seen a mining camp, in cities like Minneapolis and Chicago and Kansas City, that were about as far from the open country of her heart as it was possible to get. She was an exhibit, and she was, by now, too far gone in drink to be a reliable one. Again and again the same thing happened. She would be taken on, and she would perform for a while. The crowds delighted to see the notorious creature in person, and then the whiskey would get the better of her, and there would be a scene, and she would be let go, drunk and disorderly, and move on to the next show, and the next town, and the next slow humiliation. The West was becoming a spectacle, packaged and sold to a nation that had finished conquering it, and was already growing sentimental about it, and Calamity Jane, who had helped to build the myth, now trudged along in its baggage train, selling pennies worth of her vanished self to keep herself in whiskey and bread. The places that hired her in those years were a particular institution of the age, the dime museums, gaudy halls of curiosities in the growing cities where, for a small coin, the public could file past a jumble of freaks and marvels and relics and living exhibits. To be shown in such a place was to be ranked among the oddities, and that is what Calamity Jane had come to, a genuine frontier heroine reduced to a sideshow attraction, stood up on a little platform in Minneapolis or Chicago or Kansas City for the city crowds to gawk at between the other wonders. She would tell her tales, or a version of them fit for the hall, and sell her booklets, and try to hold herself together for the length of an engagement. But the drink undid her, again and again, as it always did, and the managers who had hired the famous frontierswoman found themselves with a difficult, unreliable, hard-drinking woman on their hands, and let her go. And she moved on to another hall in another city, each engagement a little shabbier than the last. It was a slow, public unravelling, the frontier heroine dying by inches on the dime museum stage, and it went on until even that meagre living gave out. What was being done to her in those show years was being done on a far grander scale to the whole of the West she had lived in, and it is worth seeing the one against the other. The very frontier that had only just been conquered was, even as its last wild remnants died, being repackaged and sold back to the nation as entertainment, its hardship and its violence, and its genuine tragedy smoothed into a thrilling pageant of cowboys and daring deeds. The great travelling shows toured the country and then the world with their staged hunts and mock battles, and the public, which had wanted the real frontier gone, wept with delight over its gorgeous imitation. Calamity Jane was a small, sad footnote to that vast transformation, one genuine survivor, peddling herself amid the manufactured romance, too real and too ruined to fit neatly into the pretty picture. She had helped, with her tall tales, to spin the very myth that was now swallowing the truth, and it had made her famous, and it could not keep her fed. The West was becoming a story, the moment it stopped being a place, and she was caught, as she had always been caught, in the widening gap between the two. The furthest that strange road carried her from home was a very long way east indeed, to the shore of one of the Great Lakes, to the city of Buffalo in the state of New York, where in the opening year of the new century, a vast World's Fair called the Pan American Exposition drew millions of visitors to marvel at the wonders of a modern age. Somewhere among its grand white buildings and its electric lights and its exhibits of the shining future, Calamity Jane was put on show as a piece of the receding past, a genuine wild woman of the West, for the Eastern crowds to peer at. Picture her there, if you can bear it, an aging, ailing frontierswoman from the Black Hills Gulches, blinking under electric light in a manicured fairground 2,000 miles from any country she recognized, as far from Deadwood and the pines and the open plains as the moon. She did not last there long. She was, everyone agreed, desperately homesick, sick for the West, with an ache that the whole gleaming exposition could not touch. And before long she turned her back on the bright eastern spectacle and made her way home, back toward the only country her heart had ever known, back toward the hills, to die. There could be no sharper image of how far the world had moved than that one, the old frontier and the new century standing face to face on a fairground by a great lake. All around her at the exposition rose the confident architecture of the future, the great pale halls, the electric lights blazing after dark in a way that must have seemed like sorcery to a woman raised by tallow candle and campfire, the exhibits of machines and inventions and progress, the crowds in their city clothes marveling at the shape of things to come. And there among it all stood a survivor of the very West that all this progress had conquered and replaced, a genuine veteran of the wagon roads and the mining camps and the buffalo plains, put on show like a specimen from a vanished age. She could not have belonged there less. Everything her body and her heart understood, the smell of horse and sage and wood smoke, the feel of open ground and hard weather, and the freedom of the trail, was 2,000 miles away and already passing out of the world, and she wanted it back with an ache that no marvel of the new century could reach. So she turned around and went home, One last long journey across the continent she had spent her life crossing, though the crossing was different now. Where once she had jolted west in a canvas-topped wagon behind straining oxen, taking months over the miles, she rode home this time on the very railroads, whose coming had helped to kill her frontier, drawn back across the plains in a matter of days on the iron road, an old and ailing traveller going the wrong way against the tide of progress. Every mile brought her nearer to the country of her heart, the sagebrush flats and the far blue ridges and the dark pine hills rising at last out of the plains. And every mile must have eased something in her even as her body failed. She had been an exhibit in the east, a curiosity, a relic under electric light. She would die in the west, among the gulches and the pines near enough to home. And if she could not have the wild free country of her youth back, for it was gone, she could at least lay her bones down in the one corner of the earth that had ever truly felt like hers. The end, when it came in a plain room in a very small place, the way the ends of large legends so often do. By the summer of the year 1903, Calamity Jane was a spent woman. She was only about 50, but she had lived them at a pace and under a strain that would have worn out 3 ordinary lives. And the whiskey and the poverty and the endless hard road had all come due at once. Her body was failing her. She was drifting still, as she had drifted her whole existence through the towns of the Black Hills country that had been her one true home, when the final illness took hold of her, somewhere out on the road, and she was carried the last little distance to a place called Terry, a tiny mining settlement tucked in the hills not far from Deadwood itself. There, in a bare little room at the Callaway Hotel, the woman the whole West had heard of came quietly to the close of her story, tended in her last hours by strangers and near strangers, far from any family, worn down at the last by an inflammation of the body and by the pneumonia that so often carried off the exhausted and the poor. It says something, perhaps, about the affection she inspired even at her lowest, that the little settlement of Terry did not let her die alone. She was a stranger there, more or less, a broken old woman come among them by chance at the end of a hard road, and they might easily have left her to the cold charity of the county. Instead, they took her in, and tended her, and sat with her, doing the small, kind things that ease a dying. Because even now, worn out and penniless and famous only for a legend most of them half disbelieved, she was Calamity Jane, and something in the name and the woman moved them to gentleness. She who had spent her whole life nursing strangers was at the very last nursed by strangers in her turn, the old debt of her kindness quietly repaid by a town she had never lived in. In the final days of a road that had so rarely been shown such tenderness, there is a great and merciful quiet in that ending, after so loud a life. No gunfight, no last stand, no crowd, none of the drama the legend would have chosen for her. Only a quiet room in a plain little settlement in the hills, and a worn-out woman of about 50 who looked far older, tended by people who had known her mostly as a name, slipping away by degrees as the sickness did its work. She had come home to the Black Hills to die, and she was as near to home as she was ever likely to get, among the pines and the gulches that had held the one happy season of her whole-grown existence. Whatever thoughts moved through her in those last hours we cannot know, but it is not hard to imagine that they turned, as they had turned for 27 years, toward a man on a hillside not far off, and toward the single thing she still had the power to ask of the world. There is a detail about her dying that has haunted everyone who has ever told this story, and it is worth telling slowly, because it is the thread that ties the whole tangled skein of her together. Calamity Jane died on the first day of August in the year 1903. Wild Bill Hickok had been shot dead on the second day of August, 27 years before. She went out of the world, in other words, almost to the very day on the anniversary of the death of the man she had spent the rest of her life insisting was her one great love, the man she had known, in cold fact, for only a matter of weeks in one long-ago summer. Whether that timing was the sheerest coincidence, as it very likely was, or whether some part of a failing heart chose its moment, we will never know, and perhaps should not try too hard to know. What matters is the wish she spoke in those final days, the last request of a woman who had asked the world for very little and received less. She asked to be buried beside him. She asked that they lay her down in the hillside cemetery above Deadwood, in the ground next to Wild Bill Hickok, so that in death she might have the nearness to him that life had never once granted her, and the town gave it to her. Deadwood, that rough and sentimental old gulch, honoured the dying wish of its calamity, and it did so with a warmth that says something true about how she had been held underneath all the mockery all along. Her funeral was, by every account, the largest that the town had ever given to a woman, and one of the largest it had ever given to anyone at all. Picture it, on that summer day in the high black hills. The narrow streets of Deadwood are lined with people, the miners and the merchants and the gamblers and the fallen women and the respectable wives. The whole strange population of a frontier town turned out together, come to see the last of a woman every single one of them had a story about. The pines stand dark green on the steep slopes above. The coffin is carried up the winding way to Mount Moriah, the cemetery set high on the hillside with the whole gulch spread out below it. And there, in the ground beside James Butler Hickok, dead these 27 years, they lay Martha Jane Cannary down at last, and the West that had made her and mocked her and half loved her stood bareheaded while they did it. Stand on that hillside for a moment, in the hush after the crowd has gone, because it is where the long story finally comes to rest. Mount Moriah rises steep above Deadwood, terraced with graves among the dark pines, and from up there the eye takes in the entire narrow gulch below, the roofs and the streets of the town that had made her and mocked her, and at the last carried her up the hill on the shoulders of a great procession. They set her in the ground beside Wild Bill Hickok, exactly as she had asked. Two weathered frontier legends laid side by side beneath the trees, with the gulch they had both blown through spread out below them in the summer light. The wind moves in the pines up there, the way it must have moved on the day they buried her, and the two graves keep their long watch over the town still, and something in the plain fact of them, the wild woman and the gunfighter at rest together on the height, has drawn people up that slope to stand and wonder ever since. The funeral itself, by the accounts that survive, was a genuine outpouring, and there is something moving in the details of it. The old friends and pioneers of the gulch turned out to carry her and to see her off, men who had known her in the wild early days and remembered what she had been to the town before the drink, and the years wore her down. There were flowers and a service and a great crowd, far larger than anyone might have expected for a broken old woman who had died penniless in a hotel room, and it spoke of a real and complicated affection, the town settling its accounts with the most troublesome and beloved of its own. Some who were there said it was the largest funeral Deadwood had ever seen. They had mocked her and moved her along and shaken their heads over her for a quarter of a century, and now, at the end, they gave her the one thing she had asked for, and a great deal of honour besides, and carried her up the hill to lie beside her Wild Bill, and stood in the summer light among the pines, while the frontier said goodbye to one of the last of its true originals. The news of her death travelled far and fast, for the name still carried, and papers across the country that had not thought of her in years printed their notices of the passing of Calamity Jane, dusting off the old legends one final time. Most of them told the familiar tales, the scouting and the stagecoach and the great love of Wild Bill, repeating as settled fact the very stories she had spun in 100 saloons, so that even her obituaries were half invention, the legend outrunning the truth to the very grave and beyond. Few of the notices troubled much with the real person, the poverty and the loss and the hard, unlucky road, the mothered siblings and the nursed sick and the ache that no drink could reach. They printed the character, because the character was what the public knew and wanted, and the person went into the ground on Mount Moriah largely unrecorded, as she had lived, hidden inside her own fame. But the town that buried her knew a little more, and remembered a little truer, and gave her, in the size and the warmth of that farewell, a last verdict kinder than any headline. And so she came to rest at last on the high hillside, in the ground she had asked for, and there she remains. Climb up to Mount Moriah on a still afternoon now, more than a century on, and you will find the two graves close together among the pines, the gunfighter and the one who loved him, with the old town of Deadwood spread out in the gulch below, and the dark hills rolling away beyond it toward the plains. It is a peaceful place, high and green and quiet, with the wind moving in the trees and the light falling soft through the branches, and it is hard to stand there and not feel the pull of the story, However, much of it was invented. Here lies the frontier itself. In a manner of speaking, the wild, vanished world of the wagon roads and the mining camps and the open range, gathered up into two weathered stones on a slope. And here, more particularly, lies a poor motherless girl from a Missouri cabin who wanted only to belong somewhere and to be loved, and who, having found neither for long in life, arranged at the very last to have both in death, and got her wish, and lies in it now, quiet at last, under the pines she loved, with the town she haunted keeping watch below. Visitors still climb that slope in their thousands every year, drawn by the two names on the two stones, and many of them leave small tokens behind as they go, a coin, a flower, a trinket set on the graves in tribute, the way people do at the resting places of those who have somehow slipped the bounds of ordinary memory and become a little more than history. Few of them could tell you the true story of the woman lying there, the Missouri cabin, and the westward graves and the long unlucky road, and it does not seem to matter. They feel the romance of it, the wild frontier heroine and the fallen gunfighter side by side beneath the pines, and they pay their small respects and carry the legend a little further on. She would have liked that, one suspects. She spent her whole life making sure the world would not forget her, and it has not, and it does not. And on that green hillside above the town, the strange, sad, magnificent tale she told about herself goes quietly on being believed. So she got her wish, and there is a bitter sweetness in it that is almost too neat to bear. For the plain, quiet, historical truth, the thing the serious record supports, is that Wild Bill Hickok very probably never returned her feeling at all, that he was a newly married man in love with his own wife when he died, and that the great romance of Calamity Jane and Wild Bill is very largely a thing she built in her own lonely imagination, and told so long and so well that the world came to believe it with her. And yet there they lie, side by side on the hillside above Deadwood, to this very day, and the thousands of visitors who climb up to Mount Moriah every year to stand at the twin graves do not, most of them, know or care about the tangled evidence. They see two frontier legends laid together, and they feel the tug of the story, the buckskin heroine and the dashing gunfighter reunited under the pines, and in that sense, the sense that mattered most to her. Calamity Jane won. She wrote herself, against every fact, into the ending she wanted. The illiterate orphan who could not set down a single word of her own story nonetheless authored its final scene, and made it stick, and lies in it still, and she has never since been allowed to rest quietly in the ground she chose, for the legend she built has only grown in the century and more since she died. She has been the subject of books beyond counting, portrayed on stage and screen 100 times over, remembered and reinvented by every generation according to its own needs, sometimes as a rollicking frontier heroine, sometimes as a tragic figure, sometimes as a symbol of the untamed woman who would not be bound by her age. The graves on Mount Moriah have become a place of pilgrimage, climbed by countless visitors who know her name without knowing her story, drawn by the romance of the two legends lying side by side. Very little of what most of them believe about her is strictly true, and the real woman remains, as she always was, half hidden behind the character that bears her name. But perhaps that is the truest monument of all to what she made of herself. Out of nothing, out of poverty and loss and illiteracy and a hard, unlucky life, Martha Jane Cannary built a name that would not die, and it has outlived her by more than 100 years, and it shows no sign of dying yet. And perhaps the reason she endures, when so many louder legends of the West have faded, is that underneath the buckskin and the tall tales she was so deeply and recognizably human. She wanted what almost everyone wants: to belong somewhere, to be loved, to matter, to do right by the people she cared for, and she was thwarted in nearly all of it. Not by any villain, but by poverty and bad luck, and the sickness she carried, and the plain hard shape of her age. She met that thwarting not with bitterness, but with a rough, stubborn, open-handed courage, giving away what little she had, running toward the suffering others fled, wearing her sorrows as swagger and her tenderness as a secret. There are grander figures in the story of the frontier, and cleaner ones, and ones whose deeds were greater and truer than hers. But there are very few you would rather have sat beside at a fire on a cold night, and fewer still whose failings and whose kindness feel so entirely, achingly like our own. That, in the end, is why we remember her, and why it is worth spending an evening, all these years later, in her company. That is where I want to leave her tonight, up on the quiet hillside with the town below and the dark pines all around. Because when you strip away the tall tales and the dime novel nonsense and even the sad old whiskey, what remains is a person it is very hard not to love. Not a heroine out of a storybook, and not a joke out of a saloon, but a real and wounded and enormous-hearted woman, orphaned too young, hardened too soon, who mothered every stranger she ever found suffering, who nursed the pox-sick when braver men ran, who wanted more than anything to do right by her child, who loved one impossible man across a quarter of a century of loneliness, and who asked at the very end only to be laid down near him on a hill she loved. The world gave her a name meant half in mockery, and she wore it like a crown, and she made it immortal. Martha Jane Cannary, Calamity Jane. However the record judges the legend, the heart of her was true. And if these long journeys into other lives and other nights are a comfort to you, if you like having somewhere quiet to travel to at the end of the day, then you are always welcome to stay and wander through a few more of them with me, whenever the world gets loud and you need the dark to feel a little kinder. I am always glad of the company on these evenings, glad to know there is someone out there in the quiet, traveling the same old roads. Thank you for spending these few hours here with me tonight, high in the Black Hills, with the pines standing watch and the whole hard, brave, heartbroken story of Calamity Jane finally come to its rest. And now let the town below go dark, one lamp at a time. Let the voices fade and the streets empty, and the pines settle into stillness on the slopes. Let the hillside grow quiet, and the two old graves keep their long watch over Deadwood, and the whole weary, wonderful century drift away into the night like smoke off a dying fire. There is nothing left tonight that needs your carrying. The road is behind you now. The fire is low. You can let your thoughts grow slow and heavy, and let the hills hold the story safe, and let yourself sink down soft and warm into the deep and welcome dark. Rest now. There is all the time in the world. Sleep well. Stay warm. Be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.